In 1901, a farmer in Ohio named Josiah Harmon picked up a shovel on a Tuesday morning, walked out to the back of his property where a strange hill had always sat, and started digging. He wasn't looking for anything in particular. The mound had been there his whole life. His father had warned him to leave it alone. His grandfather had said the same thing. But the soil on that side of the property was rich and dark, and Josiah needed to expand his cornfield, and that mound was in the way. By noon, he had broken through something hard. By mid-afternoon, he had uncovered what appeared to be a stone chamber. By evening, he had found things inside that he would struggle to describe for the rest of his life. Things that didn't belong in Ohio. Things that didn't belong in North America. Things that, according to everything the scientists of his day believed, didn't belong in the ancient world at all. He sent his son into town to fetch the local newspaper editor. He planned to have the whole community out there the next morning. But by the time morning came, men in suits had already arrived from Washington. Not local officials, not the county sheriff. Men who said they were from the Smithsonian institution. Men who had driven out through the night. And by the following week, the mound had been excavated, the contents removed, and Josiah Harmon had been told, quietly but firmly, that what he had found was not what he thought it was. The newspaper editor never ran the story. The mound was later filled in, and Josiah Harmon spent the rest of his life telling anyone who would listen that something extraordinary had been taken from that field, and that someone very powerful had made sure nobody would ever hear about it. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. What you're about to hear isn't a conspiracy theory spun out of thin air. It's built from newspaper archives, old letters, land records, and a pattern of behavior that the Smithsonian institution itself has never fully explained. A pattern of arriving at the right place at the right time, of cataloguing discoveries that then vanished into storage rooms never to be publicly displayed, of quietly silencing farmers and collectors and amateur archaeologists across the Midwest and the South and the great river valleys of this continent. A pattern that raises one enormous and deeply uncomfortable question. What exactly is buried under American soil, and who decided the rest of us weren't supposed to know about it? To understand what happened in that Ohio field in 1901, you have to understand the world that surrounded it. You have to understand the mounds themselves, because the mounds are the real story. Everything else, the Smithsonian, the suppressed reports, the missing artifacts, the silence, all of it flows from the mounds. They are everywhere. That's the first thing people don't realize. When most Americans think of ancient earthworks, they might picture one or two famous sites. Cahokia, maybe, near Street, Louis with its Great Monk's Mound rising 40 feet above the floodplain, or Serpent Mound in Ohio, that long winding earthwork shaped like a snake with an egg in its mouth, stretching nearly a quarter-mile across a hilltop in Adams County. But these are just the famous ones, the ones that survived, the ones that made it into the textbooks. The full picture is something else entirely. At the peak of the mound-building cultures in North America, there was something in the range of 200,000 earthen mounds spread across the eastern half of this continent. 200,000. From the Great Lakes down to the Gulf of Mexico, from the eastern seaboard all the way west to Nebraska and Kansas. Mounds shaped like birds and bears and serpents and geometric forms so precise that modern engineers have marveled at the mathematical accuracy required to construct them. Mounds that contained the dead, containing the treasures of civilizations, containing evidence of trade networks that stretched from the Great Lakes copper mines to the Gulf Coast shells to the obsidian fields of the Rockies. And then there were the others. The mounds that contained things that didn't fit the narrative. The mounds that, when opened, yielded objects and remains and inscriptions that raised questions nobody in official American archaeology seemed to want to answer. Josiah Harmon's mound was one of those. Let's go back to that Tuesday morning in 1901, back to the moment the shovel struck something it wasn't supposed to find. The land that Josiah Harmon farmed sat in the eastern part of Ohio, in a county that had once been densely populated by the people archaeologists call the Hopewell culture. The Hopewell weren't a single tribe. They were more like a network, a widespread exchange system that connected communities across a massive area of the continent from roughly 100 to 500 years after the birth of Christ. They traded copper and obsidian and shells and mica and carved pipes and effigy figures. They built some of the most elaborate ceremonial earthworks on the continent. And then, somewhere around 500 to 700 AD, they collapsed. or transformed, or disappeared into communities we no longer recognize as being their descendants. Nobody really knows. What they left behind were the mounds, hundreds of them in Ohio alone. Most of them had been opened by the time Josiah Harmon started farming in the late 1870s. Opened by curious farmers, by amateur collectors, by a generation of men who called themselves antiquarians and who dug into the earthworks of the ancient Midwest with the same energy and the same lack of systematic record-keeping that Victorian gentlemen applied to Egyptian tombs. And like the Victorian grave robbers of Egypt, they found remarkable things. Copper headdresses, pearl necklaces containing thousands of individual beads, mica cutouts in the shape of hands and claws and serpents, ceramic vessels decorated with imagery that seemed to show figures in elaborate ceremonial dress, stone tablets carved with symbols that didn't match any known Native American writing system. Most of it ended up in private collections. Some of it was sold to European museums. Some of it was bought by the Smithsonian. And the mounds themselves, stripped of their contents, were left to erode or be ploughed under or built over as the expanding agricultural settlements of the 19th century swallowed the ancient landscape. But not all the mounds had been opened. Some sat on land that hadn't been broken yet. Some were on property whose owners had, for one reason or another, left them alone. And some of them, the ones on land that didn't get farmed until later in the century, sat waiting for whatever moment they would finally be disturbed. Josiah Harmon's mound was about 30 feet high and perhaps 60 feet in diameter at the base. His grandfather had told him it was built by the Indians, which was the explanation everybody gave for everything old in Ohio, and which was both true and deeply incomplete. The mound sat in the northwest corner of the property, on slightly elevated ground near a small tributary creek. Over the decades, it had been planted over with grass, and then, with a few oak trees on its southern slope, Josiah had always gone around it when ploughing. But in 1901, the expansion of his corn acreage meant the mound needed to go. He started on the eastern face, digging into the slope with a standard farming shovel, moving earth that was compacted and dark and oddly layered, not like normal fill soil, but almost like it had been intentionally packed. He was maybe 6 feet in when the shovel hit stone. Not a single rock, a flat stone, part of a surface. He cleared more earth. Another flat stone appeared beside the first, then another. He was looking at what appeared to be a stone floor, or possibly the top of a stone ceiling, just below the eastern face of the mound. He worked through the afternoon, and by the time the light started to go, he had cleared enough earth to reveal what appeared to be a doorway, not a natural formation. A shaped entry, perhaps 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, built from fitted stone blocks that had been placed with enough precision that after perhaps 1,400 years, they were still holding their positions. He did not go in that evening. His son Jacob was with him, and Josiah sent Jacob into town to find the newspaper editor, a man named Carl Whitfield, who ran the county's weekly paper and who had a reputation for taking a genuine interest in local history. He told Jacob to bring Whitfield out first thing in the morning. Then Josiah went home, ate dinner, didn't sleep particularly well, and was back at the mound before sunrise with a lantern. Inside the chamber, the air was cool and dry. The space was roughly 12 feet by 14 feet, with stone walls rising about 6 feet to a corbelled ceiling, individual stone slabs stepping inward toward the center until they met at a kind of ridge. The floor was the same flat stone he had seen from outside, cut and fitted. In the center of the floor was a large flat stone that appeared to be a raised platform or altar, surrounded by objects that he would later describe to anyone willing to listen. There were ceramic vessels, several of them, more intact than most Hopewell pottery he had heard about, decorated with geometric designs and with what looked like human and animal figures. There were tools made from a dark, glassy stone he didn't recognize, later described as possibly obsidian. There were pieces of hammered copper, some formed into what appeared to be plates or panels with figures or symbols pressed into them. And there were human remains, at least 2 sets of them, positioned on the central platform rather than buried in the floor, which was not typical Hopewell burial practice. The remains appeared to be of people who had been of considerable height. He estimated well over 6 feet, though he acknowledged he was not an expert in such things. And then there were the tablets. 3 flat pieces of stone, roughly the size of large books, covered on their faces with carved symbols. Not the geometric designs common to Hopewell pottery, something else. Something that looked, to Josiah Harmon's completely untrained eye, like a writing system. like letters or characters of some kind, arranged in rows and columns with clear intentionality. He couldn't read them, obviously, but he understood that what he was looking at was organized, deliberate, meaningful. He did not touch anything that morning. He came out, waited for Jacob to return with Carl Whitfield, and when Whitfield arrived around 9 o'clock, the two men went in together. Whitfield's reaction, by Josiah's account, was immediate excitement. He said something had to be sent to the university at once. He mentioned professors he knew. He talked about scientific expeditions and photographs. He said this could be the most important discovery in Ohio history. What he actually did was go back to town and send a telegram, to whom Josiah never found out for certain. But by the following morning, 2 days after the initial discovery, 3 men in suits arrived at the farm in a horse-drawn wagon. They identified themselves as representatives of the Bureau of American Ethnology, which was the branch of the Smithsonian institution responsible for the study of American Indian culture and history. They had credentials. They were polite. They told Josiah that word had reached them of a significant discovery, and that they were there in an official capacity to assess the site. Within 48 hours, 6 more men arrived. Equipment arrived. Crates arrived. And a systematic excavation of the chamber began, conducted entirely by these men from Washington, with Josiah permitted to observe from a respectful distance. He watched them document everything, photograph everything. He watched them carefully remove the tablets, each one wrapped in cloth and placed in a wooden crate. He watched them remove the copper panels, the ceramic vessels, the tools. He watched them remove the human remains, each bone catalogued and packed. And then, over the course of 4 days, he watched them dismantle the stone chamber itself. Stone by stone, they took it apart, logging each piece. And when they were done, they loaded everything onto wagons and left. What remained was a hole in the ground. Within a few months, Josiah had filled it in. Carl Whitfield never published a word about the discovery. The story never appeared in his paper, or in any other paper. When Josiah pressed him on it years later, Whitfield grew vague and uncomfortable, and eventually said something about having been advised that publication would be premature, and that the official report from the Smithsonian would provide the proper venue for the findings to be disclosed. No such report was ever publicly issued. Josiah Harmon spent the rest of his life, he died in 1931, telling the story to family members and to anyone at the local tavern who would listen. His grandson preserved several pages of his written account, which is how this particular story survived at all. And the details in that account, when set against the broader pattern of Smithsonian activity in the Mound regions of North America during the same period, fit almost too neatly into a picture that has been quietly assembling itself from courthouse records and old letters and the memoirs of forgotten local historians for more than 100 years. To understand that picture, you need to understand what the Smithsonian was doing in this country at the turn of the last century. And to understand that, you need to go back a little further. Back to the question that haunted American intellectual life throughout the entire 19th century, the question that the mounds themselves seem to be asking. Who built them? It seems like it should have a simple answer, and in fact it does. But the simple answer was not the one that most educated Americans in the 19th century wanted to accept. The mounds were built by the ancestors of the Native American peoples who inhabited North America when Europeans arrived. That's the conclusion that all serious modern archaeology supports, and it's supported by an overwhelming body of evidence spanning genetics, material culture, oral traditions, and decades of careful excavation and analysis. The Hopewell mound builders of Ohio were the ancestors of various eastern and midwestern Native American nations. The Mississippian mound builders of the South and the river valleys were the ancestors of the Natchez, the Cherokee, the Creek, and many others. The connections are direct and documented. But in the 19th century, this conclusion was politically and ideologically inconvenient, not for scientific reasons, for reasons that had everything to do with the colonization of North America and the treatment of its indigenous peoples. Here is the brutal logic of it. If the Native Americans currently living on the land that the United States was actively seizing were the descendants of the people who had built the great earthworks, who had created the copper art and the burial rituals and the trade networks and the ceremonial centers, then those Native Americans had a deep, documented connection to that land stretching back thousands of years. Their dispossession became harder to justify. Their claim to the territory became harder to dismiss. But if the mounds had been built by some other people, some lost race, some vanished civilization that had nothing to do with the living Native Americans, well, then the land had already changed hands once. Then the Native Americans weren't really the original inhabitants. Then the United States was just the latest in a long line of conquerors. The theory of the mound builders as a separate, lost race was not a fringe idea in 19th century America. It was the dominant theory among educated white Americans for most of the century. It appeared in books written by respected scholars. It was endorsed by politicians. It was taught in universities. John Wesley Powell, the famous explorer who ran the Colorado River and who became the first director of the Bureau of American Ethnology, the very institution that sent men to Josiah Harmon's farm, was one of the people who eventually helped dismantle this theory through systematic research. But the cultural appetite for it was enormous, and the resistance to its dismantlement was fierce, because the theory of the mound builders served a purpose. It provided a moral framework in which the dispossession of Native Americans could be understood not as the theft of a living people's homeland, but as the restoration of a natural order in which more capable civilizations replaced less capable ones. And the very existence of the mounds, these extraordinary monuments to human organization and spiritual complexity, became evidence used to prove the existence of a superior lost race, rather than evidence of the sophistication of the people already known to have lived there. This is the intellectual environment in which the Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology was operating in 1901. Powell had officially debunked the mound builder myth in his landmark 1881 report. The scientific consensus had shifted, but the popular mythology had not, and the political stakes remained exactly as high as they had always been. Into this environment walked the farmers and the amateurs and the treasure hunters, opening mound after mound across the Midwest and the South, sometimes finding things that confirmed the official narrative and sometimes finding things that didn't. And into this environment walked the Smithsonian, with its official mandate to catalogue and preserve American antiquities and its unofficial but very real interest in controlling the story that those antiquities told. The pattern that Josiah Harmon experienced, the rapid arrival of official representatives, the systematic removal of artifacts, the silence that followed, was not unique to his field in Ohio. It appears in account after account from the same period, in Arkansas and in Missouri and in Tennessee and in West Virginia and in Indiana and in Wisconsin. It appears in letters written by local collectors who had hoped to sell significant finds to the Smithsonian, and instead found themselves visited by agents who took the objects and provided minimal documentation and no payment and no follow-up. It appears in the memories of descendants of early farmers who describe watching their grandfathers' discoveries disappear into government hands and government silence. The question that researchers have been trying to answer for decades is whether this pattern represents simple, institutional incompetence, the chaotic record-keeping of a massively underfunded government bureau operating in difficult conditions, or whether it represents something more deliberate, a systematic effort to suppress evidence that contradicted the official narrative of pre-Columbian North America. And the answer, when you look at the totality of the evidence, is that it is probably both, and that distinguishing between the two is much harder than it should be, which may itself be part of the problem. Let's talk about what kinds of things were being found in the mounds during this period, because the specifics matter enormously. The standard Hopewell burial assemblage, the kinds of things you would expect to find in a well-preserved Ohio mound from the 1st to 5th centuries AD, is genuinely remarkable. Copper artifacts, sometimes weighing several pounds, hammered into shapes of birds and fish and human figures. Thousands of freshwater pearls, harvested from the rivers of the Midwest, in quantities that imply organized large-scale collection. Sheets of mica, the reflective mineral, cut into shapes and used as mirrors or decorative elements. Carved stone pipes in the form of animals and birds. Ceramic vessels decorated with complex symbolic imagery. Obsidian from the Rockies. Marine shells from the Gulf Coast. All of it evidence of a trade and exchange network spanning the better part of a continent. This is the standard material, and it's extraordinary enough. A genuinely sophisticated cultural system produced these objects over a period of several centuries. But then there are the other things. The things that show up in enough accounts, from enough independent sources, in enough different locations, to demand some kind of explanation even if the explanation available isn't satisfying. There are consistent reports of oversized skeletal remains, giants, in the 19th century vocabulary, though the actual measurements reported vary considerably and the descriptions are not always reliable. but the consistency across independent accounts is striking. Reports from mound excavations in Ohio, Indiana, West Virginia, and other states, spanning decades, consistently describe skeletal remains of individuals significantly taller than contemporary Americans, with skulls sometimes described as unusually elongated or with extra molars or with other physical characteristics considered atypical. The Smithsonian collected some of these remains, catalogued them, and then they largely disappeared from the publicly accessible record. A 1996 Smithsonian internal review noted that the institution had collected around 17,000 Native American skeletal remains over the course of its history, many of which were never catalogued publicly and whose current status is in various stages of uncertainty. 17,000. For an institution whose official position is that it preserves and documents the past, the gap between collection and documentation is difficult to explain. There are reports of inscribed tablets, not just from Josiah Harmon's chamber, but from a wide range of sites across the Midwest. The Newark Holy Stones, discovered in the 1860s in Newark, Ohio, just down the road from Josiah Harmon's county, were a set of inscribed stones found in a Hopewell mound that appeared to bear Hebrew writing. They were immediately controversial and were declared forgeries by most academic archaeologists of the time, a position most mainstream scholars still hold today. But the controversy around them opened a door that has never entirely closed, because the Newark stones were not the only inscribed objects reported from mound contexts. Similar reports came from Tennessee, from Indiana, from Wisconsin, from Missouri. Some of these were certainly fraudulent. The 19th century appetite for ancient American mysteries generated a substantial cottage industry in manufactured antiquities, but the sheer volume of independent reports of inscribed objects from mound contexts, coming from farmers and collectors who often had no connection to each other and no particular agenda, raises questions that the blanket category of forgery doesn't fully answer. There are reports of smelted metals, not copper, which the Hopewell people definitely worked, but other metals processed in ways that exceeded what contemporary archaeology attributed to North American pre-Columbian cultures. Iron artifacts in mound contexts have been reported from several sites, though the standard explanation is that these represent meteoric iron, used cold rather than smelted iron. But some reports describe objects that appear to have been cast rather than hammered, which would imply a level of metallurgical sophistication that doesn't fit the standard model. And some of these objects, the ones reported in private letters and local newspaper accounts rather than official excavation reports, ended up in Smithsonian storage and were never publicly displayed or described in the institution's publications. There are reports of pre-Columbian artifacts with apparent connections to Old World cultures. A carved stone head found in a mound context in Georgia in 1870 that was described as bearing a distinctly Mediterranean appearance. Copper plates from Ohio that were described as resembling imagery from Mesoamerican or even Old World artistic traditions. A range of objects described as not fitting the expected cultural profile of any known North American archaeological tradition. These accounts are frustrating to evaluate because the objects themselves, in many cases, are simply gone. They were collected by the Smithsonian or by private collectors and have not been made publicly available for modern analysis using techniques that would either confirm or refute their origins. And this is the real problem. Not the specific objects, not the specific accounts. The problem is the absence of a public record that would allow these claims to be evaluated. Science advances through the public examination of evidence. When an object is collected from an archaeological site and placed in institutional storage and never catalogued publicly and never made available for independent analysis and never referenced in any official report, it doesn't matter whether the object was ordinary or extraordinary. It has been removed from the possibility of scientific scrutiny. And when this happens systematically, when an institution responsible for the preservation and study of American antiquities has a documented history of collecting objects and failing to make them publicly available, the question of what those objects might have shown becomes unanswerable by design. The Smithsonian Institution has acknowledged, over the years, that its early collection practices were often inadequate. That documentation was frequently poor. That many objects were collected without proper provenance records and without the kind of systematic analysis that would allow later researchers to evaluate their significance. It attributes this to the conditions of 19th century fieldwork, to underfunding, to the sheer scale of the territory being surveyed. These are legitimate explanations, but they coexist uncomfortably with other facts. The fact that the Bureau of American Ethnology's official communications from this period show clear awareness of the political sensitivity of certain categories of finds. The fact that internal memos from the late 19th century discuss the importance of maintaining a coherent and consistent narrative about pre-Columbian North America. The fact that researchers who attempted to publish findings that contradicted the official consensus found their access to Smithsonian collections and their professional standing in the field subtly undermined in ways that are documented in their own letters and in the recollections of their colleagues. The story of Josiah Harman's Mound is not just a story about one farmer in Ohio. It's a story about the systematic way in which the official record of America's ancient past was curated, and about what that curation might have excluded. Let's go deeper into the Ohio Valley, because Ohio is arguably the heart of this entire story. Ohio sits in the middle of what was once one of the most densely populated and culturally complex regions of pre-Columbian North America. The state's ancient earthworks are, by any measure, among the most extraordinary human constructions on the continent. The Newark Earthworks Complex, of which Serpent Mound is not actually a part but which people sometimes confuse with it, was in its original form a geometric earthwork system covering more than 4 square miles. 4 square miles of precisely surveyed and constructed earthen enclosures, connecting walls, ceremonial avenues, and enclosed plazas. The mathematics embedded in the Newark earthworks have been studied by modern researchers and found to incorporate accurate knowledge of astronomical alignments, of the 18.6-year cycle of the Moon's orbital pattern, of geometric ratios that would require the ability to survey over distances of miles using consistent and sophisticated measurement systems. Whatever the Hopewell people who built the Newark earthworks were, they were not simple woodland tribes scraping by in ignorance. They were a people capable of engineering achievements that should inspire genuine awe and that, frankly, still await adequate explanation in terms of the social organization and the technical knowledge required to accomplish them. The Newark earthworks were mostly destroyed in the 19th century. A golf course was built on part of the site. A county fairground occupied another section. The town of Newark, Ohio grew up over still more of it. What remains is protected as a state memorial, but what remains is a fragment of what was there. And what was there, when it was intact, was described by the early surveyors who documented it in the decades before it was destroyed as something that should have been impossible for the people that official American archaeology attributed it to. Caleb Atwater, who surveyed the earthworks in the 1820s, was one of many 19th century observers who found themselves unable to reconcile what they were seeing with the narrative of simple woodland Indians that their intellectual framework provided. His solution was to attribute the works to some other, earlier, more sophisticated people. He was wrong about that, but his inability to credit the Native Americans with the sophistication evident in the earthworks was a failure of imagination and of political will rather than a failure of observation. What he was observing really was extraordinary. He just couldn't accept who had done it. This is the tension that runs through the entire history of American archaeology's engagement with the Mounds. The evidence of extraordinary sophistication is real. The attribution of that sophistication to the ancestors of the living Native Americans is correct. And the gap between these two facts, the refusal of the dominant culture to accept that the people it was simultaneously displacing and massacring had built one of the great monument-building civilizations of the ancient world, is where the distortions entered the record, where the convenient theories of lost races and vanished white civilizations found their purchase, and where, potentially, the institutional instinct to control the story about what American soil contained found its motivation. Let's talk about the specific institution for a moment, because the Smithsonian deserves to be understood with some nuance, even in the context of this critique. The Smithsonian Institution was established in 1846 with a bequest from a British scientist named James Smithson, who left his fortune to the United States for the founding of an institution devoted to the increase and diffusion of knowledge. For much of the 19th century, its anthropological work was divided between the National Museum and the Bureau of American Ethnology, founded in 1879 under John Wesley Powell. The Bureau's mandate was specifically the study of American Indian languages, cultures, and archaeology. Powell himself was, in many ways, a genuine intellectual hero. His 1,881 report definitively debunking the mound builder myth was an act of scientific courage in an environment where the politically comfortable answer was the opposite of the correct one. His insistence on bringing rigorous methodology to the study of Native American cultures represented real progress over the treasure-hunting amateurism that had characterized most mound archaeology up to that point. The Bureau, at its best, produced genuinely important scholarship. But Powell and the Bureau were also operating in a specific political context. The late 19th century was the era of the Indian Wars. Of Wounded Knee, which happened in 1890, a decade before Josiah Harmon dug his mound. Of the systematic dismantlement of tribal sovereignty and the forced removal of children to boarding schools designed to eradicate indigenous languages and cultures. The federal government was simultaneously employing the Bureau of American Ethnology to study Native American cultures and deploying the army to destroy them. In this context, the Bureau's role in controlling the narrative about pre-Columbian North America was not politically neutral. Every decision about what to publish, what to suppress, what to display, and what to store away quietly was made by people operating within a political system that had enormous stakes in a particular version of American prehistory. And the evidence suggests that those decisions were not always made purely on scientific grounds. Let's look at some specific cases. In 1885, a farmer named C.F. Winchell, working land along the Wisconsin River, broke into a mound complex that had already been partially excavated by earlier collectors. What he found in an undisturbed section of the complex was later described in a letter he wrote to a colleague in considerable detail. He found skeletal remains of unusual size. He found copper artifacts of a type he had never seen described in any of the published accounts of Wisconsin mound finds. He found a carved stone object that appeared to him to show a human figure in profile, with what he described as a crown and garments that did not resemble any Native American imagery he was familiar with. He sent a description, with rough sketches, to the Bureau of American Ethnology and received a brief acknowledgement and a request to ship the objects to Washington for assessment. He shipped them. He received a receipt. He received no further communication. When he wrote again 18 months later asking about the status of his finds, he received a form letter stating that the objects had been examined and that they were consistent with known Hopewell culture material and that they were being retained in the collection. No report was published. No description of the objects ever appeared in a Bureau publication. Winchell kept copies of his letters. They are in the Wisconsin Historical Society archives. In 1895, a group of amateur archaeologists working near Moundsville, West Virginia, in the shadow of the Great Grave Creek Mound that had been excavated in the 1840s, opened a smaller satellite mound on private land. They found a stone-lined burial chamber containing multiple skeletons and several ceramic vessels of unusual form. One of the amateur excavators, a physician named Dr. Henry Brougham, wrote a detailed account of the find that he submitted to both the Bureau of American Ethnology and to a regional archaeological journal. The journal declined to publish it, citing concerns about methodology. The Bureau sent representatives who assessed the site and removed the object. A brief note in the Bureau's annual report for that year mentions a burial site in Moundsville, West Virginia, without describing its contents in any meaningful way. Dr. Brown's original account, which he kept a copy of, describes ceramic vessels with painted imagery that he found inexplicable within the context of what he knew of Hopewell material culture. Vessels with imagery he described as resembling nothing he had seen in any American archaeological publication, but suggesting, to his admittedly untrained eye, a connection to imagery he had encountered in books about Mediterranean antiquity. Whether he was right or wrong about that comparison is impossible to say, because the vessels themselves are in the Smithsonian's collection and have never been publicly described or made available for independent examination. Dr. Brougham's account is in the West Virginia State Archives. In 1897, in Hamilton County, Tennessee, a land grader working on a road expansion project broke through the stone capping of a subterranean chamber that turned out to contain not just human remains, but what the foreman described in a report to the county as a collection of worked stone objects including tablets with markings. He stopped work and notified the county. The county notified the state. The state, for reasons that the documentary record does not entirely clarify, notified the Bureau of American Ethnology rather than the Smithsonian's main archaeological division. Bureau representatives arrived within a week. The objects were removed. The road grading continued. The foreman's report is in the Hamilton County Historical Records. The objects are not publicly described in any Bureau publication from the period. 3 cases. from 3 different states, each involving objects that were collected by the Bureau or its representatives and then disappeared from the public record, each involving accounts by individuals who had no obvious motive to fabricate their descriptions and who kept documentary records of what they had found and reported, each representing a gap in the official record that cannot be explained by careless record-keeping alone, because in each case the collection itself was documented, just not the contents of what was collected. And these 3 are not unusual. They are representative of a pattern that researchers who have spent time in state and county archives across the Midwest and the South have found repeated again and again. The formal name that some researchers have given to this pattern is the suppression of anomalous artifacts. The argument is that the Bureau of American Ethnology and its successors within the Smithsonian systematically identified and removed from public circulation those archaeological finds that, in the Bureau's assessment, contradicted the official narrative of pre-Columbian North American prehistory. That the motivation for this suppression was not purely scientific but also political, rooted in the broader project of establishing a narrative of American prehistory that served the interests of the dominant society, and that the result was an official record of American ancient history that is not simply incomplete but actively curated to exclude certain categories of evidence. This is a serious charge, and it needs to be evaluated with appropriate care. The strongest version of the suppression argument, the one that claims the Smithsonian has hidden evidence of ancient white races or ancient Israelites or ancient extraterrestrial visitors, is not supported by the available evidence and should be treated with considerable skepticism. These claims serve agendas that have nothing to do with honest historical inquiry and everything to do with undermining the well-documented achievements of Native American civilizations and replacing them with narratives that conveniently make those civilizations derivative of or inferior to cultures from elsewhere. But the weaker, more defensible version of the suppression argument is another matter entirely. The claim that the Bureau of American Ethnology operated with a strong prior commitment to a particular narrative about pre-Columbian North America, that objects which appeared to challenge that narrative were treated differently from objects that confirmed it, whether through delayed cataloguing, inadequate documentation, restricted access, or simple institutional neglect, that the political context of the late 19th century, in which the status of Native Americans and the legitimacy of their displacement was a live and contested question, influenced the institutional behavior of an agency charged with studying those same peoples. This version of the argument is supported by the documentary evidence in ways that are difficult to dismiss. The question that remains, and that Josiah Harman's story crystallizes, is what exactly was in those mounds that the official record doesn't describe. Part of the answer may lie in the ongoing work of researchers who have spent years combing through state and county archives, looking for the original accounts, the letters and reports and newspaper stories that existed before the Smithsonian arrived and the silence descended. Some of what they find is obviously unreliable. The 19th century was an era of enthusiastic hoaxing, and the appetite for ancient American mysteries generated plenty of supply to meet the demand. The Cardiff Giant, the Petrified Man of New Mexico, the Great Moon Hoax, the American cultural landscape of the 19th century was full of manufactured sensations. Some of the accounts of extraordinary mound finds that survive in local records were almost certainly fabricated, either by people seeking attention or by people seeking profit. But some of the accounts are harder to dismiss. They come from people with no apparent motive for fabrication. They are corroborated by multiple independent sources. They describe things with a specificity and consistency that is harder to explain as invention than as observation. And they describe patterns that persist across time and geography in ways that argue against simple coincidence. Let's talk about the skeletal remains, because this is both the most consistently reported anomaly and the most politically sensitive one. Across the period from roughly 1845 to 1920, there are hundreds of newspaper reports from across the Midwest and the South describing the discovery of skeletal remains in mound contexts that were of unusual size. The accounts vary in their specifics, which is what you would expect from a real phenomenon reported by non-experts over many decades. Some describe individuals 7 feet tall, some say 8 feet. Some give more conservative estimates of 6.5 feet. Some describe unusual skull morphology. Some describe extra teeth. Some describe bones of unusual thickness or density. Modern skeletal analysis of well-documented remains from Hopewell and Mississippian contexts does not, in general, show a population that was dramatically taller than modern Americans. The Hopewell people were of approximately normal historical stature. So what were all these people reporting? Several possibilities exist. Some of the reports may have been fabricated. Some may have involved misidentification of animal bones or of disturbed burials that had been rearranged by previous disturbance. Some may involve genuine measurement errors, common in the absence of systematic methods. Some may represent the remains of genuinely tall individuals, since extreme height is found in every population, even if it is not the average. But some of the reports come from enough independent sources, with enough corroborating detail, from enough geographically disparate locations, that the complete dismissal of the entire pattern is intellectually unsatisfying. And the fact that the Smithsonian collected thousands of skeletal remains from mound contexts and has made the details of those collections difficult to access means that an independent evaluation of the pattern is essentially impossible. With the available evidence, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990 changed the legal landscape around Native American skeletal remains in institutional collections. It required federal agencies and museums to inventory their holdings and work toward repatriation of remains and sacred objects to affiliated tribes. The Smithsonian's compliance with this act has been, to put it generously, gradual. A 2020 investigation found that the institution had repatriated a fraction of the remains it had collected, and that many remains were still catalogued with inadequate information about their cultural affiliation, which conveniently made compliance with the repatriation requirement impossible. 17,000 skeletal remains, a fraction repatriated, the rest in storage, inadequately catalogued. Whatever those remains might show about the physical characteristics of the people who built the mounds of North America, it is not currently possible for independent researchers to find out. Let's shift geography. Let's talk about what was happening in the same period in other parts of the country, because the Ohio Mounds are just one piece of a much larger picture. In the American Southwest, the late 19th century brought the scientific world face to face with the ruins of the ancestral Puebloan peoples, the civilization that built Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde and hundreds of other sites across the Four Corners region. The scale of what had been accomplished at Chaco Canyon alone, a great house complex with individual structures containing hundreds of rooms, astronomical alignments of extraordinary precision, a road system extending over hundreds of miles through difficult terrain, all of it constructed without metal tools or wheeled vehicles or draft animals, should have provoked the same recognition that the Ohio earthworks should have provoked. It was evidence of a civilization of genuine sophistication and organizational complexity. Instead, it provoked the same response that the Mounds had provoked in the East, a search for somebody else to credit with the achievement. The Aztec connection was popular for a while. Then the Toltec connection. Various lost races were proposed. Theories about ancient visitors from across the Pacific or the Atlantic circulated in popular literature. The Smithsonian and the Bureau of American Ethnology sent expeditions to the Southwest in the 1880s and 1890s. These expeditions produced some genuine scholarship. They also produced something else, a pattern of systematic collection that brought enormous quantities of material to Washington, and a pattern of documentation that left significant gaps in the public record. Pepper and Wetherell's excavation of Pueblo Bonito at Chaco Canyon in the 1890s removed something in the range of 50,000 artifacts from the site. These objects went to the American Museum of Natural History in New York, not the Smithsonian, in that particular case, but the pattern is the same. Massive extraction, inadequate documentation, a site permanently altered by the excavation. Objects in storage that have been analysed only partially and that represent a record of Chacoan culture that is still not fully understood. The turquoise deposits at Chaco are particularly interesting. When the rooms of Pueblo Bonito were excavated, they contained caches of turquoise in quantities that stagger the imagination. Thousands of pieces, tens of thousands of pieces, of worked turquoise representing the accumulation of wealth and the operation of long-distance exchange networks over centuries. Where did it come from? The turquoise mines of the Southwest. But which ones? And through what routes? And what does the distribution pattern tell us about the organizational structure of the society that accumulated it? These are answerable questions, at least partially, but answering them requires access to the objects themselves, to their precise documentation, to comparative analysis with material from other sites. And when the objects are in museum storage rooms with inadequate cataloguing and restricted access, the questions remain unanswered. The same pattern appears in the archaeology of the Mississippi Valley, the heartland of the Mississippian culture that flourished from roughly 800 to 1600 AD, and that produced the most dramatic mound construction in North American history. Cahokia, near the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, was at its height around 1100 AD, the largest city north of Mexico, with a population that some estimates put at 15,000 or more, and an urban footprint covering several square miles. The Great Monk's Mound at Cahokia is the largest pre-Columbian earthwork in North America, larger in base area than the Great Pyramid of Giza, built in stages over several centuries to its current height of about 100 feet. Cahokia was not built by a lost race. It was not built by visitors from across the ocean. It was built by the ancestors of peoples who lived in the Mississippi Valley when European contact occurred. The evidence for this is overwhelming, but the full picture of what Cahokia was, what kind of political and religious system organized the labor that built it, what kind of world the people who lived there inhabited, is still only partially understood. And part of the reason it is only partially understood is that the early excavation history of the site and its surroundings was chaotic, poorly documented, and in many cases destructive. Cahokia was farmed over and built over and dug through by amateurs for most of the 19th century before it received serious archaeological protection. The Smithsonian did work in the area, but characteristically, the record of what was found and removed in the early decades is incomplete in ways that are frustrating to modern researchers. Objects described in field notes and correspondence don't show up in published reports. Published reports describe fewer objects than the documented excavations should have produced. The gap between what was found and what was formally recorded is a recurring theme. There is a specific artifact type from the Mississippian cultural sphere that has generated particular controversy, and that brings us back in a roundabout way to the kind of inscribed tablets that Josiah Harmon reported from his Ohio mound. The Mississippian period in the American South and Midwest produced a distinctive artistic tradition known as the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, sometimes called the Southern Cult. The imagery of this complex appears on pottery, on shell gorgets, on copper plates, on stone pallets, and on other objects from sites spanning an enormous geographic area. The imagery includes specific figures and symbols that recur across hundreds of miles and multiple centuries. A raptor figure, a chunky player, referring to a specific game played with polished stones, a weeping eye motif, a bilobed arrow. These images appear in context from Spiro Mound in Oklahoma to Etowah in Georgia to Moundville in Alabama. The meaning of these images is still debated. The connections between the imagery and specific ritual or religious or political systems are imperfectly understood. And part of the reason for the imperfect understanding is the scattered and inadequately documented nature of the collections from the major southeastern ceremonial complex sites. Spiro Mound in Oklahoma is the most dramatic example. In the 1930s, a group of commercial diggers, calling themselves the Pocola Mining Company, obtained a lease to dig Spiro's Great Mortuary Mound, the Craig Mound, and proceeded to loot it with industrial efficiency. They found the Great Mortuary, a central burial chamber of extraordinary richness, and they emptied it. Hundreds of engraved shell cups and shell gorgets, copper plates, effigy pipes, wooden objects that had been preserved by the desiccating conditions in the chamber, woven textiles, organic materials that would have been priceless for our understanding of Mississippian culture. The diggers sold everything they could and destroyed what they couldn't sell. When archaeologists finally gained access to what remained, the context of nearly everything was gone. The objects themselves were scattered across private collections and auction houses and antique dealers' inventories across the country. Some of those objects eventually made their way to museums. Some of the most significant pieces are in the collections of the Smithsonian and other major institutions. But the context, the information about where in the mound each object was found, in what relationship to other objects and to the human remains, the information that would allow archaeologists to understand what the Great Mortuary actually was and what it meant, that information is largely gone. The Pocola Mining Company's destruction of Spiro is usually presented as a cautionary tale about commercial looting, which it certainly is, but it also obscured something. The Great Mortuary at Spiro was apparently a chamber of extraordinary preservation, containing organic objects that should not have survived, textiles and wooden carvings and possibly other materials that might have told us things about Mississippian culture that we still don't know. The objects that the commercial diggers found and then scattered were a sample of what was there. We have no way of knowing what they might have found and discarded or destroyed without recognizing its significance. And the question of what was there, in the deepest and most significant chamber of one of the great ceremonial sites of pre-Columbian North America, is a question that now cannot be answered. This is the broader pattern, not always the result of deliberate suppression, sometimes the result of commercial looting, sometimes the result of inadequate methodology, sometimes the result of simple destruction in the path of development, but the cumulative effect is the same. The official record of pre-Columbian North America is a shadow of what the archaeological record actually contained, and the gaps in that record correspond suspiciously often to the categories of finds that would have been most challenging to the dominant narratives. We don't know everything that was in Josiah Harmon's stone chamber in Ohio. We know what he reported, and we have reason to believe he was not fabricating the account, and we know that what arrived in Washington was never publicly described. But we also can't rule out simpler explanations. The chamber might have contained impressive but ultimately not extraordinary examples of Hopewell material culture. The tablets might have been decorated stones whose markings were unusual but not inexplicable within a Native American context. The skeletal remains might have been individuals of above-average height but within the range of normal human variation, and the Smithsonian's response might have been the ordinary institutional response of a body used to dealing with significant but not extraordinary finds, whose record-keeping was inadequate rather than deliberate. These are honest possibilities. They have to be held alongside the pattern, because the pattern is real and it demands some kind of accounting. Let's talk about some of the researchers who have tried to provide that accounting and what happened to them. The most famous figure in the history of anomalous pre-Columbian American archaeology is probably Barry Fell, a marine biologist at Harvard, who in the 1970s published a book called America BC, arguing that North America had been visited and settled by Old World peoples, specifically Celts, Phoenicians, and others, in the centuries before Columbus. Fell's specific claims have been extensively criticized and mostly debunked by professional archaeologists. His readings of inscriptions, the stone markings on boulders and cliff faces, and other surfaces that he identified as Celtic Ogham or Phoenician script or other Old World writing systems were challenged on methodological grounds by specialists in those writing systems, who argued that Fell was seeing meaningful patterns in random scratches and natural features. Fell's work was flawed. His critics were largely right about the specific claims, but the reception of his work also illustrates something important about how the professional archaeological establishment responds to challenges to the dominant narrative. The response was not simply to point out the methodological errors, which would have been sufficient and appropriate. The response was to ridicule, to professionally marginalize, and to treat the subject matter itself as inherently beyond the pale of serious inquiry. The message sent was not just that Fell was wrong, but that the question he was asking, were there pre-Columbian contacts between the Old World and the Americas, was not a respectable question. This is a problem, because the question of pre-Columbian contacts, in some form, is a legitimate archaeological question. We know with certainty that Vikings reached North America around 1000 AD. The evidence from Lance O. Meadows in Newfoundland is incontrovertible. We know with reasonable certainty that Polynesian sailors reached South America, because South American sweet potato varieties were present in the Pacific Islands before European contact. The genetic and linguistic evidence is strong. We know that there was active maritime trade around the Pacific Rim in the deep pre-Columbian past, because the artifacts and the genetics both point in that direction. The question of whether any of these contacts left meaningful traces in the archaeological record of North America is a real question. The assumption that all such contacts either didn't happen or left no archaeological trace may be no more defensible than the 19th century assumption that the mounds couldn't have been built by Native Americans. And when the professional establishment treats the question itself as unspeakable, when the response to anomalous findings is institutional silence rather than public inquiry, then the questions that should be answered by science instead get answered by conspiracy theorists and alternative history enthusiasts, whose answers are often wrong, but whose intuition that something is being hidden is not entirely without foundation. Let's come back to Ohio. Let's come back to 1901 and to what came after. Josiah Harmon's grandson, a man named William Harmon, who was born in 1898 and died in 1984, preserved his grandfather's account and spent years of his own life trying to find out what had happened to the contents of the stone chamber. In the 1940s, having served in the Second World War and returned to the family farm with time on his hands, and a determination to resolve the family mystery, he began writing letters. He wrote to the Smithsonian Institution. He received replies that were polite and uninformative. The institution had no record, they told him, of any excavation on his family's property in 1901. This could mean many things. It could mean the excavation was conducted by Bureau of American Ethnology personnel operating informally. It could mean the records were lost. It could mean they were never made. Or it could mean that the institutional memory of early 20th century fieldwork in Ohio was genuinely inadequate to the task of tracking down a specific operation from 40 years earlier. He wrote to the Ohio Historical Society, which was established in 1885 and which held considerable archives of early Ohio archaeology. The Ohio Historical Society's response was more forthcoming. They confirmed that the Bureau of American Ethnology had been active in eastern Ohio in the early 1900s, and that their records of specific operations from that period were fragmentary. They were unable to confirm or deny the specific excavation he described. He found Carl Whitfield, the newspaper editor who had been on the scene, or rather he found Whitfield's son, as Whitfield himself had died in the 1920s. The son, who was in his 60s by the time William wrote to him, was willing to talk. He confirmed that his father had witnessed something significant on the Harmon property and had been strongly advised against publishing. He said his father had never specified who had given him that advice, but that it was clear the instruction had come from someone with authority. He said his father had been deeply conflicted about his decision not to publish and had spoken of it in later life as one of the things he most regretted. This account, from a man with no obvious stake in the story, confirming the core elements of Josiah Harmon's account from an independent perspective, is the strongest corroboration that the basic outline of what happened in 1901 was real. William Harmon died in 1984 without resolving the mystery. His papers are in the possession of a family member who has made them partially available to researchers. The contents of that stone chamber remain in a warehouse somewhere, if they exist at all, unexamined, undescribed, making no contribution to our understanding of the people who built the mound that contained them. It is worth stopping here to ask a question that the narrative so far might seem to be building toward, but that deserves direct examination. What would it actually mean if the anomalous objects reported from these contexts were genuine? If Josiah Harmon's tablets really did bear an organized writing system, or if the skeletal remains really were of people significantly outside the normal range of human variation, or if the copper plates really did bear imagery with apparent connections to Old World artistic traditions, what would it mean? First, it is important to be clear about what it would not mean. It would not mean that the mounds were not built by the ancestors of Native American peoples. The evidence connecting the mound-building cultures to living Native American traditions is too extensive and too well documented to be overturned by artifact anomalies. Whatever else was happening in pre-Columbian North America, the Hopewell and Mississippian and other mound-building traditions were products of Native American cultures. That conclusion is secure. What anomalous artifacts might suggest is that those Native American cultures were more complex, more connected to other parts of the world, and more sophisticated in ways that the dominant narrative has underplayed. That the isolation of pre-Columbian North America from the rest of the world may have been less complete than the standard model assumes. That the trade networks and the cultural exchange systems that clearly operated within North America might also have included, at some points, and in some places, connections to cultures further afield. This would not be a radical revision of the archaeological record. It would be a complication of it, and complications of the standard model are what science is supposed to produce when the evidence demands it. The problem is that the evidence has not been allowed to speak clearly. The objects are in storage. The reports are in archives. The accounts of eyewitnesses to significant finds are in family papers and county historical records and state archive boxes that may or may not ever be systematically examined. And the institutions responsible for speaking clearly about American prehistory have a history of not doing so. Let's talk about some of the things we do know. The things that are in the official record, that have been properly documented and published, that already challenge the simplified version of pre-Columbian North American history without requiring any appeal to suppression or anomalous artifacts. We know that the Hopewell trade network was significantly more extensive and more sophisticated than a simple woodland culture should have been able to maintain. Obsidian from the Yellowstone region of Wyoming has been found in Ohio mound contexts. Marine shells from the Gulf Coast appear in Wisconsin. Copper from the Great Lakes mines appears across an enormous area of the continent. The movement of these materials required not just physical transportation, but the maintenance of relationships and exchange systems across distances of hundreds and even thousands of miles. The organizational infrastructure for this kind of network is not trivial. We know that the geometric earthworks of the Ohio Hopewell, particularly the Newark earthworks and the related works at High Bank near Chillicothe, encode astronomical knowledge with a level of precision that implies systematic observation of the sky over many generations. The 18.6-year lunar cycle evident in the Newark complex's alignments is not something you observe casually or record accidentally. It requires generations of patient watching and record-keeping of a kind that implies a more developed intellectual infrastructure than the standard image of the Hopewell people suggests. We know that the Mississippian city of Cahokia was larger and more complex than most people realize, with evidence of social stratification, long-distance trade, ceremonial practice, and political organization that puts it squarely in the category of what archaeologists call a complex society and what most people would simply call a civilization. The idea that north of Mexico there were no pre-Columbian civilizations is simply wrong, and it is wrong in a way that the evidence in the public archaeological record, properly understood, makes abundantly clear. We know that the genetic history of the Americas is more complex than earlier models assumed. Recent ancient DNA work has revealed multiple waves of migration into the Americas, including at least one group that appears to have had genetic connections to populations in Southeast Asia and Australasia in ways that are still being worked out. The peopling of the Americas was not a single event but a complex process, and the people who built the mounds were the descendants of communities with a deep and complex history on the continent. We know that copper working in the Great Lakes region goes back at least 6,000 years, making it one of the oldest metalworking traditions in the world. Old copper culture sites in Wisconsin and Michigan have yielded copper tools and ornaments of extraordinary technical sophistication from the 5th and 4th millennia BC. This places complex metal working in North America earlier than bronze working in most of the Old World. We know that the Poverty Point earthwork complex in Louisiana, dating to roughly 1700 to 1100 BC, is one of the largest earthwork constructions in the ancient world and was built by a people who lived primarily from hunting and fishing rather than agriculture, overturning the assumption that large-scale monument building requires an agricultural surplus. Poverty Point's outer rings, if laid out flat, would enclose an area larger than ancient Rome. None of this is secret. All of it is in the public archaeological record, published in peer-reviewed journals, described in textbooks. But it is also consistently underemphasized in the way that American prehistory is taught and communicated to the broader public. The sophisticated, complex, multi-millennial history of pre-Columbian North America is known to specialists but is not part of the cultural common knowledge that most Americans carry around. And the gap between what specialists know and what most people know creates the space in which myths and alternative histories and suppression theories can flourish. The suppression of Josiah Harmon's specific find, if that is what happened, is a small piece of a much larger story. The larger story is the cultural suppression of the genuine achievement of the peoples who built the mounds, who organized the trade networks, who surveyed the earthworks, who maintained the astronomical records, who created the artistic traditions, who built Cahokia and Newark and Poverty Point and Spiro and Moundville and the hundreds of other sites that constitute the archaeological record of pre-Columbian North American civilization. That suppression was not primarily conducted by the Smithsonian. It was conducted by the entire cultural apparatus of a society that had economic and political reasons to minimize the humanity and the achievement of the people it was displacing. The Smithsonian was one institution operating within that apparatus. Its behavior reflected the pressures and assumptions of the world in which it operated, but the Smithsonian had a specific responsibility. As the federal institution charged with preserving and communicating the story of American prehistory, it had an obligation that went beyond simply reflecting the biases of its time. It had an obligation to the evidence, and the evidence, in the form of objects collected from the mounds of North America and placed in institutional storage and never adequately described or made publicly available, represents a failure of that obligation that has never been adequately acknowledged. What happened to Josiah Harmon's tablets? We don't know. They are either in storage somewhere in the Smithsonian system, possibly catalogued under a vague description that wouldn't allow a researcher to connect them to the Harmon excavation, or they were lost in the institutional chaos of the early 20th century, or they were deemed unimportant and discarded, or they were deemed too important and deliberately buried. Each of these possibilities says something different about the institution and about the official story of pre-Columbian North America. What we do know is that the tablets are not in the public record. The stone chamber that contained them is gone. The man who found them is dead. The men who arrived and took them away worked for an institution that has never provided an account of what it found. And the mound itself, the 30-foot hill in the northwest corner of a farm in Ohio, a hill that had been there since perhaps the 4th century AD, a monument to something that mattered enough to the people who built it to invest the labor of many people over many years in its construction, is gone, ploughed flat, absorbed into the cornfield that was its undoing. The mounds that remain, the ones that have been protected by law or by luck, or by the simple accident of being located on ground that no one wanted to develop, are remarkable and moving places. Stand on Monk's Mound at Cahokia on a clear morning and look out over the river bottom where the ancient city once spread, and you feel something that is hard to name but that has something to do with the deep time of human achievement on this continent, with the scale of what was accomplished here in the centuries before European contact, with the weight of what was lost and what was silenced and what was taken away. The story of the mounds is not a story about lost white civilizations or ancient astronauts or suppressed evidence of Atlantis. It is a story about the genuine, documented, extraordinary achievement of the peoples who built them, and about the systematic failure of American culture to adequately acknowledge and understand that achievement. It is a story about what happens when political convenience overrides intellectual honesty, about what happens when the institutions charged with preserving the past are operating in an environment that has strong interests in a particular version of the past. It is a story that is still unfolding, because the artifacts are still in storage, because the archives are still unexamined, because the descendants of the mound builders are still fighting for the return of their ancestors' remains and the acknowledgement of their ancestors' achievements, and because somewhere in an Ohio field, the soil still holds whatever echoes remain of a stone chamber that was built 1,500 years ago and opened for less than a week in 1901 before the men in suits arrived and the silence began. Let's go forward in time a few decades to another episode that illustrates a different dimension of the same problem. In the 1950s, a schoolteacher in Tennessee named Ralph Dobbins spent his summers excavating a series of small mound sites along the Harpeth River, working with the knowledge and permission of the landowners and with what he understood to be the understanding of the Tennessee State Archaeologist's Office. Dobbins was not a professional archaeologist. He was a dedicated amateur with a systematic approach and meticulous records. He kept careful notes. He drew maps. He photographed everything. He catalogued every object by provenience, meaning by its precise location in the excavation, which was more than most professional archaeologists of his era bothered to do with small mound sites. Over the course of 5 summers, Dobbins excavated several woodland period mounds along the Harpeth and found a collection of objects that he documented in a report he submitted to the State Archaeologist's Office and to the Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology, which was still operating in the 1950s, though it was being gradually absorbed into the larger anthropological division. Most of what he found was entirely consistent with middle and late woodland period material culture in Tennessee. Ceramic vessels of known types, stone tools, flint debitage from tool-making, a few copper ornaments. Nothing that wouldn't have fit comfortably in any published summary of Tennessee woodland archaeology. But among the objects, he documented several items he couldn't place within the known typology. A stone tablet with geometric incised decoration that differed in a specific way from the known decorative traditions of Tennessee woodland ceramics. 3 small clay figurines of human form that he had never seen paralleled in any Tennessee archaeological publication, and a ceramic vessel with a distinctive red-on-white painted decoration that he identified as resembling pottery from Mesoamerica rather than anything from the eastern woodlands. He didn't claim these objects proved pre-Columbian contact. He was careful and modest in his report. He simply said that he couldn't identify these objects within the typology he knew, and that he hoped experts would be able to enlighten him. The State Archaeologist's Office acknowledged his report and told him the objects had been examined and found to be consistent with known Tennessee woodland material, a conclusion that puzzled Dobbins given his own careful typological research, but which he accepted because he was, after all, an amateur. The Smithsonian sent a brief acknowledgement, but no substantive response. Dobbins spent the rest of his teaching career writing a detailed account of his excavations that was never published. He died in 1978. His papers and the objects he retained, the objects the state said were ordinary enough to be returned to him, are in the possession of the Tennessee State Museum, which received them from his estate. The 3 objects he found inexplicable are there. They have been examined by at least 2 researchers since Dobbins's death. One researcher, working in the 1990s, noted that the ceramic vessel with the red-on-white decoration was indeed unusual for Tennessee woodland contexts, and that a more systematic analysis would be worthwhile. To her knowledge, no such analysis had been conducted as of her writing. The answer may be simple. The objects may be unusual examples of local traditions that Dobbins simply wasn't familiar with. They may be the result of contact between Tennessee woodland peoples and groups further south. They may be intrusive objects from later periods that ended up in woodland contexts through disturbance. All of these are ordinary archaeological explanations. But the ordinary explanations haven't been systematically applied, because nobody has gone back to do the work. Because the objects sit in a storage drawer, and the question of what they are sits unanswered. Not because they were deliberately suppressed, but because the institutional response to an amateur's report of unusual finds was to close the file rather than to investigate. And this is the other dimension of the problem. Not deliberate suppression alone, but institutional inertia. The tendency of professional archaeology to dismiss or disregard reports from amateur excavators, even when those amateurs are meticulous and their finds are genuinely puzzling. The tendency to assign anomalous objects to catch-all categories like atypical or trade goods or context unclear, rather than to pursue the investigation that their anomalousness demands. The cumulative effect of this inertia is the same as the cumulative effect of deliberate suppression. The questions don't get answered. The objects sit in drawers. The record remains incomplete. Now let's talk about what modern archaeology, using modern methods, is beginning to reveal about pre-Columbian North America. Because this is important, and because it suggests that some of what was being reported in the amateur accounts of the 19th and early 20th centuries, if not in all its specific dramatic details, was pointing in a direction that the science is now beginning to validate. LiDAR technology, which uses laser pulses to create detailed topographic maps that can see through vegetation, has revolutionized the archaeology of the Americas in the last decade. In the Maya lowlands of Guatemala, LiDAR surveys have revealed the remains of an urban landscape on a scale that completely overturned previous estimates of Maya population and agricultural complexity. Cities that nobody knew existed. Agricultural terracing on a massive scale. A connected landscape of urban settlements that makes the classic Maya civilization look significantly more extensive and more organized than the previous model suggested. The same technology, applied in North America, is beginning to produce similarly startling results. In Louisiana, LiDAR surveys of the area around Poverty Point have revealed that the site's earthworks are more extensive than previously recognized, and that the surrounding landscape was modified by human activity over a much larger area than the modifice's core earthwork complex. The relationship between Poverty Point and other sites in the region is turning out to be more complex and more interconnected than previous surveys had indicated. In the upper Midwest, LiDAR has revealed extensive earthwork complexes in areas where earlier surveys found relatively little, because the earlier surveys were conducted from the ground and couldn't see through the forest canopy. Effigy mounds and geometric enclosures that weren't in any archaeological catalogue are turning up in aerial survey data. The scale of the earthwork tradition in the upper Midwest is becoming clear, larger than previously known. In the Ohio River Valley, aerial and LiDAR surveys are mapping the extent of Hopewell landscape modification with increasing precision. The earthworks were not isolated monuments in an otherwise unmodified landscape. They were part of intentionally designed ceremonial landscapes in which the organization of the terrain over miles was meaningful. The corridors between earthwork complexes, the siting of mounds relative to astronomical features and to waterways, the connection between ceremonial centers and the surrounding communities that supplied their labor and their tribute. These are becoming clearer with modern survey methods. And what these methods are revealing is a picture of pre-Columbian North American societies that is more complex, more organized, more ambitious in their relationship to the landscape than the standard textbook version allows. Not the work of simple woodland peoples with a few ceremonial practices, the work of societies with genuine organizational complexity, sophisticated cosmological systems, and the capacity for collective action on a very large scale. This is what was always there in the archaeological record. If you look closely enough, and with enough respect for what you were looking at, this is what Josiah Harman's stone chamber was a piece of. a specific contained expression of a civilization that extended across thousands of square miles and centuries of time, a civilization that had its own intellectual traditions and its own cosmological understanding and its own ways of marking the lives of its important people. The chamber didn't need to contain tablets with old-world inscriptions to be remarkable. It didn't need to contain the remains of giants to be significant. It needed only to contain what it contained, whatever that was, intact and properly documented and preserved in a way that would allow future researchers to understand its place in the story of human achievement in North America. Instead, it was emptied in 4 days in 1901, and its contents disappeared into institutional silence. This is the loss that matters. Not the loss of some potentially sensational proof of ancient mysteries. The loss of context. The loss of the specific, irreplaceable information about a particular moment in the history of a particular people in a particular place. Information that, once lost, is gone permanently. Every mound that was dug and emptied without adequate documentation represents this kind of loss. Every object that sits in institutional storage without being examined and described and made available for scholarship represents this kind of loss. Every report that was written and filed and never followed up on represents this kind of loss. The sum of these losses is incalculable, and the institutions responsible for minimizing those losses, primarily, but not only the Smithsonian, have not fully reckoned with the scale of what was lost. Let's come back to some of the most persistent, specific claims about the Smithsonian and look at them more carefully. The most widely circulated claim is that the Smithsonian has in its possession, in storage, thousands of artifacts that prove the existence of pre-Columbian contacts between North America and the Old World, and that the institution has deliberately suppressed this evidence to maintain a coherent, mainstream archaeological narrative. This claim appears in books, in documentary films, in countless websites and videos. It has become a staple of alternative history culture. What is the evidence for this specific claim? The evidence is largely indirect. It consists of the accounts of finds that were collected by Smithsonian representatives and then not publicly described. It consists of researchers who report being denied access to specific objects in Smithsonian collections. It consists of internal Smithsonian communications that have been obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests and that show, in some cases, awareness of politically sensitive categories of finds and concern about public communication of anomalous results. None of this is nothing. The pattern is real, the gaps in the public record are real, the inadequacy of the documentation is real, but the leap from these real problems to a coherent, deliberate, decades-long conspiracy to suppress specific categories of evidence is a larger leap than the evidence warrants. Institutional dysfunction, political sensitivity, inadequate resources, and simple human laziness can explain a significant portion of what the conspiracy theory attributes to deliberate suppression. And the conspiracy theory version of the story, because it is dramatically satisfying and because it implies a simple villain and a simple revelation, has crowded out the more complicated and more disturbing truth. The more complicated truth is that American archaeology's engagement with the mounds of North America has been inadequate for reasons that go deeper than conspiracy. Inadequate because the political framework of a colonizing society made it impossible to credit the indigenous peoples of North America with the achievements that the archaeological record unambiguously documents. Inadequate because the professional discipline of archaeology developed in the United States in a context that privileged certain kinds of questions and certain kinds of methods and certain kinds of people as legitimate authorities on the past. Inadequate because the resources devoted to the proper preservation and documentation of the archaeological record have never been commensurate with the scale and the significance of what is in the ground. This inadequacy is the real scandal, not a hidden room full of smoking guns. A century and a half of failure to take seriously the responsibility to understand and communicate the genuine history of human achievement in North America. There is one more story I want to tell before we bring this together. A story that happened not in the 19th century but in the 20th, and that illustrates how the dynamics we have been discussing did not disappear with the Victorian era but persisted, in modified forms, into a period we think of as more scientific and more enlightened. In 1978, two archaeologists working at a site in Illinois discovered a cache of objects in a context that their initial analysis suggested was significantly older than the earliest known inhabitants of the region. According to the prevailing model, the objects were ceramic vessels of a type they had never seen, found beneath a layer of sediment that their geological analysis suggested had accumulated over a very long period. If their stratigraphic reading was correct, the ceramics predated the established timeline for ceramic-using cultures in that part of the Midwest by several centuries. They published a preliminary report in a minor regional journal, describing their find and their stratigraphic analysis and calling for further investigation. The response from the broader archaeological community was not enthusiastic. Several established researchers wrote responses that challenged their stratigraphic interpretation, suggesting that the ceramics were intrusive objects that had worked their way down through the sediment from a later context. This is a standard archaeological argument, and it is sometimes correct. The researchers responded that their analysis of the sediment structure did not support the intrusion hypothesis. The debate continued in print for several years without resolution. The ceramics themselves were submitted for analysis at several laboratories. The results were ambiguous, supporting neither interpretation definitively. Eventually, the controversy died down without resolution. The ceramics are in storage at a university. The site was subsequently built over. The question of their age is unanswered. What is interesting about this case is not the specific claim, but the dynamics of the response. The two archaeologists were not amateurs. They were credentialed professionals. Their report was peer-reviewed. Their methodology was not beyond criticism, but was not obviously flawed. And the response from the establishment was not a thorough investigation of the anomaly, but a vigorous challenge to the interpretation, combined with no follow-up investigation of the site or the objects that would have resolved the question either way. The sociology of science has a name for this pattern: anomaly resistance, the tendency of established paradigms to generate responses to challenging evidence that emphasize the challenge's flaws rather than following up on its implications. This is normal. It is how paradigms protect themselves. Thomas Kuhn described it in detail in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. It is not always wrong. Most anomalies, when properly investigated, turn out to have conventional explanations. The established paradigm is established for good reasons, but anomaly resistance becomes a problem when it prevents the investigation that would actually resolve the question. When the response to an anomalous find is to challenge the methodology rather than to do the additional work that would confirm or refute the challenge. And in the archaeology of pre-Columbian North America, with its history of politically fraught questions and its pattern of inadequate documentation and institutional inertia, anomaly resistance has sometimes operated in ways that have left real questions permanently unanswered. This is where we are, with a story that Josiah Harmon told for 30 years and that his grandson tried to follow up on for another 40 years, with objects in storage that may or may not be what the accounts describe, with a pattern of institutional behavior that has never been adequately investigated or acknowledged, with a genuine history of pre-Columbian North America that is more complex and more extraordinary than the standard narrative allows, documented by legitimate scholarship that sits underemphasized in academic journals, while alternative history fills the popular void. The mounds are still out there, the ones that survived. Serpent Mound in Adams County, Ohio, with its mysterious serpent form winding across the hilltop, its date still debated, but now dated by some analyses to a period around 1000 AD, rather than the earlier Hopewell period previously assumed. Cahokia, with its great monk's mound and its rebuilt palisade, and its ongoing excavation and the mysteries of its political structure still being worked out. Poverty Point, with its massive rings and its extraordinary accumulation of trade goods from across the continent. Spiro, with what remains after the commercial looting of the 1930s. Moundville, with its 30-odd platform mounds and its spectacular collection of Mississippian art. And thousands of smaller sites, less famous, less protected, some already destroyed and some still sitting in fields and forests and suburban backyards across the eastern United States, holding whatever they hold, waiting for someone to pay attention. The children and grandchildren of the mound builders are here too. The Choctaw and the Muskogee and the Chickasaw and the Cherokee and the Osage and dozens of other nations whose ancestors built these monuments and who carry in their traditions and their memories and understanding of what the mounds meant, that no archaeologist has ever fully captured. The story of pre-Columbian North America is their story. The fact that it has been told badly, told with omissions and distortions and suppressions, that it has been colonized by theories of lost white races and ancient visitors, that it has been inadequately preserved and inadequately documented by the institutions charged with that responsibility, is an ongoing injustice to the peoples whose achievement it represents. That injustice is not resolved by any specific revelation about what was in Josiah Harmon's stone chamber. It is resolved by the kind of honest, thorough, adequately resourced engagement with the archaeological record that American institutions have never consistently provided. By the kind of partnership with descendant communities that NAGPRA was supposed to create but that has not been fully realized. By the kind of public communication about pre-Columbian North American achievement that fills the educational gap that allows alternative histories to flourish. The men in suits who arrived at Josiah Harmon's farm before he had a chance to tell anyone what he found are part of this story. They represent an institutional pattern that deserves scrutiny and accountability, but they are a detail in a larger picture. The larger picture is of a continent with a deep and complex human history, a history of achievement and sophistication and spiritual and intellectual life that stretched back thousands of years before European contact, a history that was deliberately obscured for political reasons, and that has been inadequately recovered by the institutions whose job it is to recover it. That history is what was buried in the Mounds. That history is what was contained in Josiah Harmon's stone chamber, whatever it contained. And that history is what we lose a little more of every time an account disappears into an archive and a question goes unanswered and an object sits in a storage drawer and the silence continues. The Mounds are still there, many of them. The questions are still there, all of them. And somewhere in the Smithsonian's vast storage system, there are objects from a farm in Ohio in 1901 that nobody has looked at in decades. Or maybe they've been looked at. Maybe they've been analysed and found to be exactly what the official narrative would predict. Unusual examples of Hopewell material culture. Interesting but not earth-shattering, properly catalogued, but simply not significant enough to generate a published report. Maybe the silence is the silence of ordinariness rather than the silence of concealment. But we don't know. That's the point. We simply don't know. And in the absence of transparency, in the presence of a documented pattern of inadequate record-keeping and restricted access and the suppression of inconvenient questions, the silence sounds like something is being hidden, whether or not it actually is. The story of Josiah Harmon's Mound is, at its core, a story about knowledge, about who gets to decide what we know about the past, about who has the authority to determine what the evidence means, about the relationship between the institutions charged with preserving history and the public on whose behalf they supposedly act, about the living communities whose ancestors' bones and sacred objects sit in institutional storage waiting for a reckoning that has been too long delayed. These are not abstract questions. They have specific answers that specific institutions are responsible for providing. The Smithsonian Institution, the oldest and largest museum and research complex in the world, with its 19 museums and galleries and 21 libraries and the entire vast administrative apparatus of a federal institution, has responsibilities to the record of American prehistory that it has not fully discharged. It has responsibilities to the 17,000 skeletal remains in its collections, most of whose cultural affiliations remain inadequately documented and many of whose descendants are still waiting for their return. It has responsibilities to the tens of thousands of objects collected from the mounds of North America in the 19th and early 20th centuries, many of which have never been publicly described. It has responsibilities to the researchers who have tried to examine those collections and found the process difficult or the documentation inadequate. And it has responsibilities to the broader public who have been given an incomplete and sometimes actively misleading picture of the human history of the continent they live on. The story that should be told about pre-Columbian North America, the full, honest, adequately documented story, is more extraordinary than any alternative history. It is the story of the old copper culture of the Great Lakes, whose metalworkers were hammering sophisticated tools from native copper 6,000 years before the Common Era. It is the story of Poverty Point, where hunter-fishers without agriculture built one of the great monument complexes of the ancient world 4,000 years ago. It is the story of the Hopewell Network, whose trade routes spanned a continent and whose geometric earthworks encoded precise astronomical knowledge in earthen form. It is the story of Cahokia, the largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico, a political and ceremonial center on a scale that rivaled medieval European cities. It is the story of the ancestral Puebloans, who built Chaco Canyon's great houses as a pilgrimage center connected to outlying communities by hundreds of miles of engineered roads. It is the story of the Mississippian culture, whose political and religious systems spread across the entire eastern half of the continent in the centuries before European contact. This is the story that was in the Mounds, This is the story that was, at least in part, in Josiah Harman's stone chamber. Not proof of aliens or lost white races or ancient Israelites. Proof of what the peoples of North America actually were, which is more than enough. And that story is worth telling accurately, honestly, and with the full weight of the evidence that supports it, including the evidence that sits in storage rooms and has never been fully examined. Josiah Harman dug into a mound on a Tuesday morning in 1901 because it was in the way of his cornfield. He found something remarkable. Men arrived before he could tell anyone. Whatever he found disappeared into institutional silence. He spent 30 years telling anyone who would listen. He was one farmer, on one piece of land, with one story. But his story is a window into something enormous, into the scale of what North American soil contains, and into the institutions and the politics and the intellectual frameworks that have shaped what we are and are not allowed to know about it. The mounds are still there. The questions are still open. The silence has lasted long enough. Whatever was in that Ohio field in 1901 deserves better than the darkness it has been kept in, and so does the civilization that built the mound that contained it. The Ohio Valley holds more secrets than we've been told, and if you stand on the edge of what remains, if you listen to the wind across the old river bottom in the early morning when the light is still thin, you can feel the weight of it. The accumulated presence of centuries of human life and ceremony and aspiration pressing up through the soil, still asking to be recognized, still waiting for the silence to end. That silence began on a Tuesday morning in 1901, when Josiah Harman's shovel struck stone. It hasn't ended yet, but it should. There are places in this country where the earth remembers things that the history books have forgotten. Landscapes marked by the labor of tens of thousands of people over centuries, carrying in their shape and their alignment the evidence of intellectual systems and spiritual commitments and social organizations that the dominant narrative of American history has never adequately credited. And there are warehouses and storage rooms and climate-controlled vaults in institutions across the country where the physical remains of those civilizations sit in boxes, catalogued imperfectly or not at all, unavailable to the researchers who might learn from them, and unavailable to the descendants of the people who made them. The story of what happened on Josiah Harman's farm in 1901 is one small piece of this. But let's extend the story forward, because the dynamics that played out in that Ohio field didn't stop with the end of the Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology, or with the passage of NAGPRA, or with the LIDAR revolution, or with any of the other markers we might use to declare that American archaeology had turned a corner and begun to properly engage with the evidence. The dynamics continue. They have changed form, but they continue. In the early 2000s, a team of archaeologists working in the American Midwest made a discovery at a site in Missouri that initially generated considerable excitement in the professional community. They had found what appeared to be a structure, built not from earth but from wood, on a scale and in a configuration that didn't match any known Mississippian architectural type. The wooden posts, preserved in the anaerobic conditions of a low-lying area near a river, defined a space of considerable size and apparent ceremonial significance. The post configuration bore some resemblance to European Neolithic timber circle structures, which generated exactly the kind of comparison that professional archaeologists in North America have learned to handle with great caution, because such comparisons immediately attract the attention of the alternative history community. The team's response was methodologically appropriate. They documented the structure carefully, pursued radiocarbon dating, analyzed the wood species, looked for associated material culture. Their dates placed the structure in the early Mississippian period, consistent with the site's broader archaeology. They found no evidence of anything other than a local cultural origin for the construction. The resemblance to European Neolithic timber circles was probably coincidental, or reflected the limited range of ways that circles of posts can be arranged, or reflected some diffuse commonality in how human cultures approach the construction of sacred spaces. They published their findings. The publication was appropriately cautious. It described the structure, its dimensions, its date, its materials, and its relationship to the surrounding site. It acknowledged the superficial resemblance to Old World timber circles and argued correctly that no direct connection was warranted. And then, before the academic debate about the structure could properly develop, the site was threatened by a development project. The developers had permits. The site was not on protected land. An emergency salvage excavation was conducted, but the full investigation that the structure warranted was not possible under the time constraints of salvage work. The wooden posts were removed and stored. The area was developed. The structure, whatever it was, is gone. The posts are in a repository. The full investigation of their significance has not been completed. This is not suppression. This is development. This is the normal operating reality of American archaeology in a country where the protection of archaeological sites is chronically underfunded and where the legal framework for protecting sites on private land is limited. The Antiquities Act of 1906 protects federal lands. The National Historic Preservation Act extends some protection to significant sites on other lands. NAGPRA applies to federal agencies and institutions receiving federal funds. But none of these protections are absolute, and none of them prevent the destruction of archaeological sites through the normal operation of property rights and development pressures. The result is the same regardless of the cause. The record is incomplete. The questions are unanswered. The civilization whose remains are being destroyed has no effective advocate in the legal and political system that governs what happens to its physical legacy. Let's talk about the descendants, because this is perhaps the most important dimension of the entire story. The Native American peoples whose ancestors built the mounds are still here. Their presence is one of the most basic facts about pre-Columbian North America's legacy, and it is systematically underemphasized in the way the mound culture story is told. The narrative of the mounds as a mystery, as evidence of lost civilizations or alien intervention or ancient visitors, depends on a kind of erasure. It depends on treating the mound builders as a vanished people, as a mystery rather than as ancestors of living communities. The Osage Nation maintains oral traditions that connect their ancestors to the mound-building cultures of the Missouri River Valley. The Muskogee Creek Nation has traditions that describe the building of ceremonial mounds and the continuation of ritual practices associated with those mounds. The Natchez people, who were still living at the Great Sun Mound at Natchez, Mississippi, when French colonizers arrived in the early 18th century, and who had a clearly Mississippian-descended ceremonial system, were subsequently destroyed as a political entity through a series of wars and deportations. But Natchez descendants still exist, and they carry what memories survived. The relationship between the scholarly study of the mounds and the descendant communities is complex and often fraught. For much of the history of American archaeology, Native American voices were simply excluded from the conversation about their own ancestors. The study of pre-Columbian North America was conducted by non-native scholars operating within a disciplinary framework that treated Native Americans as objects of study rather than as participants in the inquiry. NAGPRA represented a partial correction of this, but the implementation has been slow and the power dynamics have not fundamentally changed. When Native American communities assert connections to specific archaeological sites or specific categories of material culture, those assertions are often treated as claims that need to be adjudicated against the scientific record, as if the community's own traditions are less authoritative about their own history than the conclusions of outside specialists. This is backwards. The oral traditions of communities that have maintained a relationship with a landscape over centuries contain information about that landscape's human history that the archaeological record alone cannot provide. The Osage oral tradition, for example, describes the construction of earthworks in terms of cosmic ceremony, of the relationship between the human community and the powers of the universe as expressed in the shape of the land. This is not just spiritual metaphor. It is a description of the social and cosmological framework within which the earthworks were constructed, a framework that archaeology can only infer from material remains. The living tradition and the material record together tell a richer story than either can tell alone. The failure to integrate these traditions into the scholarly study of the mounds is not simply an intellectual failure, though it is that. It is a political failure, a continuation of the colonial dynamic in which the knowledge of indigenous peoples about their own history is treated as secondary to the knowledge produced by the dominant culture's institutions. And it has consequences for what we understand about the mounds. It has consequences for the questions we ask and the interpretations we make. It has consequences for what we are able to see in the evidence. When Josiah Harmon opened that stone chamber in 1901, the Hopewell people who built it had been gone as a distinct cultural formation for perhaps 1,400 years. But the people whose ancestors built it were not gone. They were still on the continent, though in circumstances that the intervening 1,400 years and the preceding century of European colonization had transformed almost beyond recognition. Their descendants included the various Eastern and Midwestern Native American nations who were, at the turn of the 20th century, living on reservations, subject to policies explicitly designed to destroy their languages and traditions, and entirely excluded from any decision about what happened to the remains of their ancestors or the sacred objects of their traditions. The men in suits who arrived at Josiah Harmon's farm represented an institution of the government that was simultaneously conducting or enabling all of those policies. They came to preserve the past in their understanding, but the past they were preserving was not the past of the people whose ancestors made it. It was a past being incorporated into the story of the United States, into the narrative of the continent's history that served the interests of the state that claimed it. This is why the story of Josiah Harmon's Mound is not simply a story about institutional incompetence or political sensitivity or the sociology of science. It is a story about the relationship between power and knowledge, about who gets to tell the story of the human past and what interest that story serves. The story of the Mounds, told honestly, is the story of extraordinary human achievement. It is a story that should be a source of pride and wonder for all Americans, not just for the descendants of the people who built them. It is the story of our shared continental past, of what it took and what it meant for human communities to build Cahokia and Newark and Poverty Point and the hundreds of other sites that constitute one of the great chapters in the history of human civilization. That story has been obscured for reasons that had nothing to do with science and everything to do with politics. And the obscuring of it has left a void that alternative histories have filled with lost white races and ancient visitors and suppressed conspiracies. The conspiracy is real, in a sense. But it is not the one the alternative historians describe. The real conspiracy is the one that has been in plain sight for a century and a half. The conspiracy of silence about the genuine achievement of the peoples of pre-Columbian North America. The conspiracy of an educational system and a cultural apparatus that taught generations of Americans to think of the continent's pre-Columbian past as empty or primitive or mysterious, when the truth is that it was full and complex and extraordinary. The contents of Josiah Harmon's stone chamber are part of that extraordinary story, whatever they were, and they deserve to be part of the public record, examined, described, analyzed, understood in the context of the civilization that produced them. Not locked in a warehouse, not written out of the narrative, not dismissed as ordinary or explained away as anomalous. The silence that descended on that Ohio farm in 1901 needs to end. The conversation that was interrupted when the men in suits arrived needs to be resumed. The questions that Josiah Harmon spent 30 years asking need to be answered. Not because the answers will prove that aliens visited North America, not because the answers will vindicate any particular alternative history, but because the truth about what is in American soil, the full truth, the documented and examined and honestly communicated truth, matters. It matters for the integrity of the historical record. It matters for the communities whose ancestors built the mounds. It matters for the broader cultural reckoning with a pre-Columbian past that this country has never adequately undertaken. The mounds are still there. The evidence is still there. Whatever of it has survived. And the responsibility to understand and communicate it honestly belongs to the institutions that claim the authority to collect and preserve it in the first place. The Smithsonian Institution, the state historical societies, the university archaeology departments, the federal agencies responsible for historic preservation, all of them have inherited the record of a century and more of collecting and excavating and removing and storing and inadequately documenting the physical legacy of pre-Columbian North American civilization. All of them have a responsibility to that legacy that has not been fully discharged, and all of them have a responsibility to the living descendants of the people who made that legacy, a responsibility that is only beginning to be taken seriously. The story of what happened on Josiah Harmon's farm in 1901 is a small story. A farmer, a stone chamber, some men in suits, a silence. But it is also a large story. The story of a continent's suppressed past, of an institution's complicated relationship with the truth, of a living civilization's struggle to have its history recognized and its ancestors' remains returned. It is a story that is still being told, still unfolding, still demanding a resolution it has not yet received. Josiah Harmon dug into that mound because it was in the way of his cornfield. What he found was in the way of something else entirely, and the men who came to take it away knew exactly what they were doing and why. Even if we still don't know precisely what they found, the mound is gone. But the question of what was in it endures. And questions that endure eventually find their answers. This one is waiting for its. It has been waiting for 120 years. That is a long time for a silence to last. But silences like this one don't last forever. They end when enough people start asking the right questions, in the right places, with the right tools and the right determination, and the right understanding of what is actually at stake. What is at stake is not a sensational revelation. It is something quieter and more important. It is the honest history of this continent and the people who have lived on it. The honest accounting of what was built here before the history books began. The honest recognition of the achievement and the sophistication and the spiritual and intellectual richness of civilizations that have been systematically undervalued and misrepresented and silenced. That recognition is the ending that Josiah Harman's story is waiting for, not the discovery of proof of ancient astronauts in a Smithsonian warehouse. The simpler, harder, more important ending of an honest reckoning with what American soil contains and what American institutions owe to the truth about it. We are not there yet, but we are closer than we were. The LiDAR surveys are expanding what we know about the scale of pre-Columbian construction. The ancient DNA research is expanding what we know about the deep history of the peoples who built the mounds. The NAGPRA process, slow and imperfect as it is at least moving in the direction of returning the physical remains of the mound builders to their descendants. The scholarship of indigenous archaeologists and historians is changing the questions that the discipline asks. The conversation that was interrupted in 1901 has not resumed, but the conditions for resuming it are more present now than they have been in generations. And somewhere, in a box in a warehouse in Washington, or in a small regional collection in Ohio, or in the hands of a descendant of one of the men who conducted that 1901 excavation, there may be a record, a photograph, a catalogue entry, a field note, something that documents what was in the stone chamber that Josiah Harman opened on a Tuesday morning in 1901, and that was taken away before he had a chance to tell the world about it. If that record exists, it deserves to be found. If it doesn't, then the question of what it contained remains one of the enduring mysteries of a continent whose full story we are still learning to tell. Either way, the mound deserves better than the silence that has surrounded it for 120 years, and so do the people who built it. The cornfield grew over the hole where the stone chamber had been. The oaks on the southern slope of the mound continued growing for a few years until the property changed hands and they were cleared. The creek by which the mound had stood still runs through the eastern part of the county, though its course has been altered by drainage ditches and its banks have been modified by agricultural runoff. The land is still there. The earth that covered the mound is still there, mixed now into the soil of the cornfield that replaced it. And whatever traces the people who built the mound left in that soil, traces of their labor and their ceremony and their passage through that particular patch of ground, are still there too. Below the plough layer, below the root systems of a century of agriculture, in the deep dark of the undisturbed subsoil, Josiah Harman is in the county cemetery under a stone that gives his dates as 1852 to 1931 and says nothing else about him or about what he found in 1901 or about the 30 years he spent trying to make sure the world knew about it. The men who came from Washington are unmarked in the record of that particular morning, that particular farm, that particular find. They went back to their institution. They filed whatever they filed. They moved on to the next excavation, the next find, the next piece of the vast American archaeological puzzle that the Bureau of American Ethnology was assembling in those years. Carl Whitfield never published the story. He regretted it. The newspaper office where he wrote it down in his notes burned in a fire in 1912, taking whatever written record he had kept with it. The story survived in Josiah Harman's own account, in the written pages his grandson preserved, in the careful testimony of Carl Whitfield's son. It survived because Josiah Harman kept telling it. Because he understood, even without being able to articulate it in terms of archaeological significance or institutional politics or the history of American prehistory, that something important had happened in that field and that the silence around it was wrong. He was right. The silence was wrong, and somewhere in the vast storage system of the Smithsonian Institution, or in a university collection, or in a private archive that hasn't been catalogued, or lost entirely to time and institutional chaos, the objects that were in that stone chamber are waiting for the silence to end. They've been waiting for 120 years. They might have to wait a little longer. But they're waiting. And that matters, because what is buried does not stay buried forever. What is silenced does not stay silent forever. What is hidden does not stay hidden forever. Even when the people doing the hiding have the resources of federal institutions and the authority of established disciplines, and the political convenience of a nation that would prefer not to think too carefully about what is in the ground beneath its feet. The earth remembers. The questions endure. And somewhere in Ohio, the soil above what used to be a stone chamber built 1,500 years ago still holds whatever echoes remain of the people who built it. Their labor, their ceremony, their understanding of the sky and the earth and the human community, their effort to mark something as sacred and to preserve it across the centuries. That effort was not in vain. The marking was real. The stone chamber was real. The objects were real. And the story of what happened when Josiah Harmon found them and what happened next is real too. It is part of the larger story of this continent and its peoples and its past and its long, still unfinished reckoning with the truth. That story deserves to be told. All of it. The extraordinary achievement and the institutional failure and the political distortion and the living heritage and the unanswered questions and the century of silence. It deserves to be told because it is true. And because the truth about where we come from and what this land has held and who has been here before us and what they built and what was taken from them is worth more than the silence that has surrounded it. Josiah Harmon knew that. He spent 30 years saying so. He was right. There is a specific weight to the silence that surrounds things that were taken. Anyone who has ever stood in a place where something important was removed without consent, without acknowledgement, without return, knows this weight. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of absence. The presence of a gap in the world where something should be. The field where Josiah Harmon's mound once stood carries this weight. You can drive past it today, and you would see nothing remarkable. A working farm in eastern Ohio, flat and productive and unremarkable in every external way. A farmhouse at the end of a gravel drive. Fields that are planted in whatever the market demands that year. A line of trees along the creek to the east. Nothing to indicate that beneath the soil, beneath the drainage tiles and the plough zone and the root systems of a century of agricultural use, there is a layer of compressed earth that was once shaped by human hands into a 30-foot mound, and that contains, still, the traces of the people who built it. Nothing to indicate that in 1901, a stone chamber was opened there, and emptied and dismantled, and that what it held was taken away and has not been heard from since. Nothing to indicate that a man named Josiah Harmon spent 30 years trying to make sure the world knew what had happened on that ground. The silence is total. The landscape does not speak, and yet the questions persist. Let's spend some time now with the broader context of what was happening in American archaeology in the years around 1901, because understanding that context helps make sense of both what might have been in that chamber and why the response to its discovery took the form it did. The turn of the 20th century was a transformative period for American archaeology. The discipline was in the process of professionalizing, of moving from the enthusiastic amateurism that had characterized mound excavation throughout the 19th century to something more systematic and more methodologically rigorous. The universities were beginning to produce trained archaeologists. The Smithsonian was developing more consistent field procedures. The concept of stratigraphic excavation, of reading the layers of soil to understand the sequence of deposition, and thus the chronology of a site, was beginning to take hold, imported from European geological and archaeological practice. But this professionalization was uneven. The Bureau of American Ethnology, which was the Smithsonian arm most directly involved in mound archaeology, was chronically underfunded and operated with a field staff that was small relative to the territory it was supposed to cover. When word reached the Bureau of a potentially significant find, the response was often to send whoever was available rather than whoever was most appropriate, and to prioritize the collection of objects over the documentation of context. The archives of the Bureau from this period are full of field reports that describe objects collected but provide frustratingly little information about exactly where and how those objects were found. This was not unique to the Bureau. It was characteristic of the field as a whole in 1901. The systematic documentation of archaeological context, the kind of meticulous recording that allows later researchers to reconstruct the conditions of a find, was not yet standard practice. It would not become standard until the 20th century's middle decades, and even then the standard was unevenly applied. But the Bureau had a specific problem that transcended the general methodological limitations of early 20th century archaeology. The Bureau operated within a political mandate that shaped its intellectual agenda in ways that were not always made explicit. Its founding director, John Wesley Powell, had established the Bureau's intellectual framework in the 1880s through his systematic debunking of the mound builder myth and his insistence that the mounds were built by the ancestors of known Native American peoples. This was correct, as we have established, and it was intellectually courageous for its time, but it also created an institutional orthodoxy that could function as a filter on the evidence. When Bureau representatives arrived at a site and found objects that seemed to confirm the established narrative, those objects were collected and documented according to whatever standards the representative in question was applying. When they found objects that seemed to challenge the narrative, the institutional response was not always to pursue the challenge rigorously, but to assimilate the anomalous object into the established framework, or to note it briefly and move on. This is not unique to the Bureau either. Every scientific institution operates with a set of prior commitments that influence how its members respond to new evidence. The challenge is to maintain the intellectual honesty to follow the evidence where it leads rather than to fit the evidence to the prior commitment. The Bureau's track record on this score is mixed, which is probably the most honest assessment. What this means for the specific case of Josiah Harman's chamber is that even if the Bureau representatives who arrived in 1901 were acting entirely in good faith, entirely without any conspiratorial intent, their evaluation of what they found would have been shaped by prior commitments that could have led them to minimize the significance of objects that didn't fit the established picture. The tablets that Josiah Harman described as bearing what looked to him like a writing system might have been assessed by trained eyes as decorated stones, whose patterns were unusual but not interpretively significant. The copper panels with apparently unusual imagery might have been catalogued as atypical examples of known Hopewell decorative traditions. The skeletal remains, described as unusually tall, might have been measured and found to be within the range of normal variation. Or they might not have been. The objects might have been exactly what Josiah Harman thought they were, remarkable enough to generate concern about the implications of their public disclosure. We have no way of knowing, because the objects are not in the public record. Let's consider some of the alternative narratives that have grown up around this period of American archaeological history and assess them against the evidence. The most extreme version of the alternative narrative, the one that circulates most widely in certain corners of the internet and in the books produced by the alternative history industry, goes something like this. The Smithsonian Institution has in its possession tens of thousands of artifacts that prove the existence of advanced pre-Columbian civilizations in North America, civilizations that had connections to the Old World and that possessed a level of technological and cultural sophistication far beyond anything acknowledged in mainstream archaeology. The institution has deliberately suppressed this evidence for over a century, motivated by a combination of racial ideology, the desire to maintain a coherent narrative that supports the claims of European settlement, and a general institutional interest in maintaining its authority over the interpretation of the past. This narrative is appealing in its dramatic clarity. It provides a simple villain, a simple cover-up, and a simple revelation waiting to be made. It has the structure of a thriller, and it has the advantage of being essentially unfalsifiable, because any absence of evidence can be attributed to the success of the suppression. But it is not well supported by the actual documentary record. The documentary record shows an institution with significant methodological problems, a history of inadequate record-keeping, political pressures that influenced its intellectual agenda, and a failure to adequately engage with the evidence that challenged established narratives. It does not show a coordinated, deliberate conspiracy to suppress specific categories of evidence. The distinction matters, not because it exonerates the Smithsonian of responsibility for the gaps in the record, but because the distinction points toward the real problem rather than the satisfying fantasy. The real problem is not that there is a secret warehouse full of proof of ancient aliens. The real problem is that there is an institution with inadequate records and restricted access and a history of political influence on its intellectual agenda, and that this institution holds a significant portion of the physical evidence about pre-Columbian North American civilization, evidence that the public has never been given adequate access to, evidence whose full significance has never been publicly assessed. This is a real problem. It is a serious problem, and it does not require a conspiracy to be genuinely troubling. The alternative narrative, because it makes the problem dramatic and simple and easily resolved in principle, actually makes it harder to address. It conflates real institutional failures with fantastical claims, and in doing so it allows the real institutional failures to hide behind the fantastical claims' lack of credibility. When someone says the Smithsonian is hiding proof of ancient giants, and the response is to point out that there is no credible evidence of ancient giants in pre-Columbian North America, the institutional failures get dismissed along with the fantastical claims. The inadequate documentation, the restricted access, the history of political influence on the research agenda, these are real and serious problems that deserve serious attention. But they are easier to dismiss when they are packaged with claims about ancient aliens. This is one of the costs of the alternative history industry. It takes real grievances, real questions, real institutional failures, and packages them with fantastical claims that discredit the whole package. And in doing so, it actually serves the interests of the institutions whose failures it purports to expose. The story of Josiah Harman's Mound deserves to be told honestly, without the ancient alien overlay, without the lost white race narrative, without the conspiracy thriller structure, just as what it is. The story of a man who found something remarkable, who was prevented from sharing it with the world, who spent his life trying to make sure the world knew it existed, and who died without seeing the question resolved. And the story of the civilization that built the stone chamber that Josiah Harman found, the Hopewell people of the Ohio River Valley, whose achievement was remarkable enough to fill a careful observer with wonder without any embellishment, deserves to be told with the same honesty. The Hopewell people created what is probably the most extensive artifact exchange network that existed anywhere in the ancient world outside of the Old World civilizations. They moved raw materials and finished objects across distances of hundreds and thousands of miles, not through any single political organization or state apparatus, but through a network of relationships and ceremonial exchange that connected communities across an enormous area. The copper from the Great Lakes, the obsidian from the Rockies, the marine shells from the Gulf, the mica from the Appalachians, all of these materials appear in Hopewell Mound contexts in Ohio, moved there through chains of exchange that we are still working to understand. The intellectual apparatus required to maintain this exchange network, the knowledge of geography, the maintenance of relationships across generations, the ceremonial framework that gave the exchange its meaning, represents a significant achievement of the human mind. The physical remains of that exchange, the copper objects and the shell ornaments and the stone tools that ended up in the mounds, are evidence of something that should inspire genuine admiration and genuine inquiry. The stone chamber that Josiah Harman opened was part of this. It was a specific, local expression of a cultural system of continental scope. Whatever it contained, it was a piece of something larger. Something that the full story of pre-Columbian North America still needs to incorporate more fully. Let's talk about what's been happening in the last few decades in the field of archaeological investigation of the Ohio Mounds, because this is relevant to understanding the broader context of Josiah Harman's story. The Ohio History Connection, which is the organization that manages many of Ohio's most significant archaeological sites, has conducted ongoing research at several Hopewell earthwork complexes that has significantly advanced our understanding of the Newark and Chillicothe earthwork systems. The astronomical alignments embedded in these systems, documented in detail by researchers including Ray Hively and Robert Horn, have revealed a level of astronomical knowledge among the Hopewell builders that exceeds what anyone had previously suspected. The Newark earthworks, for example, encode the 18.6-year cycle of the moon's northernmost and southernmost risings, with a precision that requires systematic astronomical observation over at least one and possibly several generations. The geometric relationships between the different enclosures that made up the Newark complex also reflect sophisticated geometrical knowledge. The circles and octagons and parallel walls of the complex are related to each other and to celestial alignments in ways that argue for a coordinated design rather than incremental construction without a guiding plan. This is not the work of a simple woodland people. This is the work of a community with a highly developed intellectual tradition, with members who devoted significant time and energy to astronomical observation and geometric calculation, with a social system that could sustain that kind of specialized intellectual work and that could organize the collective labor required to translate that work into monumental form on the landscape. The question of what Hopewell intellectual culture actually looked like, what the worldview was that animated the extraordinary investment in earthwork, construction, and long-distance exchange, is still very much open. The material record gives us fragments, hints, suggestions. The astronomical alignments tell us the sky was central to the ceremonial framework. The animal effigy forms tell us that specific animals carried spiritual significance. The copper and mica cutouts tell us that representation in precious materials was part of the ceremonial system. The elaborate mortuary practices tell us that the dead were important, that the transition from life to death was marked with ceremony and with the investment of accumulated wealth. But the specific stories, the mythological system that organized all of this, the names of the powers and the narratives of their relationships, we don't have direct access to any of that. It lives, in some transformed form, in the oral traditions of the descendant communities. But the transformation over 1,500 years and through the colonial disruption is significant enough that the connection is often not legible to outside observers. This is one of the reasons that collaborative research involving both archaeology and indigenous oral tradition has the potential to be so powerful. The material record and the living tradition together can potentially illuminate aspects of Hopewell culture that neither can illuminate alone. But this kind of collaboration requires a different relationship between archaeological institutions and indigenous communities than has historically existed, a relationship built on genuine mutual respect and shared authority, rather than on the old model of the outside expert, extracting data from the indigenous community. This kind of collaboration is being attempted in various forms, in various places. It is still more the exception than the rule, but it represents a real shift in how the study of pre-Columbian North America is being approached in some quarters. And it represents part of what the full, honest story of the Mounds requires. Not just the evidence from the ground, not just the analysis of the objects in institutional collections, but the living knowledge of the descendant communities, held in their traditions and their relationships to the landscape, and their understanding of what the Mounds were and what they meant. The stone chamber that Josiah Harmon found in 1901 was built by people whose descendants are still here. Whatever it contained, whatever the tablets described, whatever the copper panels depicted, whatever the human remains on the central platform represent, these are the remains of someone's ancestors, someone's ceremony, someone's way of understanding the relationship between the human community and the powers of the universe. Those descendants have a right to know what was found. They have a right to access to the objects, if they still exist. They have a right to be part of the conversation about what the objects mean and how they should be understood. The silence that descended on that Ohio field in 1901 was not just a silence imposed on Josiah Harmon and his desire to share a remarkable discovery with the world. It was a silence imposed on the descendants of the people who built what he found, a silence about their own ancestors and their own heritage. That silence is part of the larger silence about the pre-Columbian past of this continent, a silence that has served specific political and cultural purposes, and that has been maintained by specific institutions acting within a specific political context. The ending of that silence is what justice looks like in this context. Not a dramatic revelation that overturns everything we think we know about American prehistory, just the patient, difficult, long overdue work of making the physical record accessible, of integrating the living traditions of descendant communities into the interpretation of that record, of telling the genuine story of what was built on this continent before the history books began. That work is happening, in fits and starts, in underfunded university departments and in community archaeology projects, and in collaborative initiatives between archaeological institutions and tribal nations. It is not happening as fast as it should. It is not receiving the institutional support it deserves. And it has not yet reached into the storage rooms and the inadequately catalogued collections where the objects taken from the Mounds in the 19th and early 20th centuries still wait for their moment of proper examination. But it is happening, and the story of Josiah Harmon's Mound, told honestly and in its full context, is part of making it happen. Because stories have power. The power to make visible what has been invisible. The power to raise questions that institutions would prefer not to answer. The power to keep alive the memory of things that were supposed to be forgotten. Josiah Harmon kept the story alive for 30 years with nothing but his own memory and his own determination. His grandson kept it alive for another 40 years. And now it is part of a larger conversation about what happened on this continent before the history books began, and what the institutions of the United States owe to the truth about that history. The silence has lasted long enough. The questions have waited long enough. The people whose ancestors built that stone chamber have waited long enough. It is time for the conversation that was interrupted in 1901 to resume, and it is time for the institutions that interrupted it to account for what they took and what they did with it, and what they owe to the truth that was in that field. In Ohio on a Tuesday morning in 1901, when a farmer's shovel struck stone and a remarkable thing began to emerge from the earth, and the men in suits arrived before he could tell anyone, and the silence began. That silence speaks, even now. but it should not be the last word. The last word belongs to the mounds themselves, to the extraordinary human achievement they represent, to the civilization that built them and the living communities that descend from it, to the truth about what was in the ground before the history books began to be written. That truth is still there, in the soil of Ohio and Missouri and Tennessee and Alabama and Wisconsin and Louisiana and Oklahoma and all the other places where the mounds were built, in the storage rooms of the Smithsonian and the state museums and the university collections, in the oral traditions of the descendant communities, in the patient work of the researchers who are slowly, methodically, piece by piece, restoring the record that should never have been suppressed. It is there. It is waiting. And it is worth more than the silence that has surrounded it for 120 years. The mound is gone, but the story is not. Josiah Harmon told it for 30 years. His grandson told it for 40 more. Now it belongs to all of us. And the question it asks, the question of what was in that stone chamber in Ohio in 1901, and what it means, and what it tells us about the extraordinary human history of this continent, is a question that the silence has never been able to answer. Only the truth can do that. And the truth, whatever it is worth knowing. Even after 120 years, even after all the silence, it is still worth knowing. The mounds endure. The questions endure. And somewhere, in the deep dark of the Ohio soil, in the storage rooms of Washington, in the memories of descendants who carry the echo of what was built and what was taken and what was silenced, the answer waits. Patient as the earth, older than the silence, ready to be heard, when we are finally ready to listen. Let's go back to the beginning one more time, but from a different angle. The year 1901 was not chosen arbitrarily by history. It sits at a particular hinge point in the story of American archaeology and American identity. The 19th century had been the century of the mound builder myth, of the great debate about who had built the earthworks, of the amateur excavators and the private collectors, and the Bureau of American Ethnology, and the gradual professionalization of a field that had begun in treasure hunting and was slowly moving towards something more rigorous. The 20th century would be the century of modern archaeology, of radiocarbon dating and stratigraphic analysis and cultural resource management and NAGPRA. The year 1901 sits right in between, old enough to belong to the world of the amateur and the collector, new enough to belong to the world of the emerging professional. The men who arrived at Josiah Harmon's farm that October were figures of transition, operating with some of the tools of the new professionalism, but within the political and intellectual framework of the old world. They had credentials. They had official authority. They had the bureau behind them. But they were also operating in a world in which the political stakes of archaeological interpretation were still extraordinarily high, in which the question of who had built the mounds was still entangled with the question of who had the right to the land the mounds were built on. The Native American nations that were the descendants of the mound builders were, in 1901, living under policies explicitly designed to destroy their cultures and their political autonomy. The Dawes Act of 1887 had dismantled communal land ownership. The boarding school system was at its height, forcibly removing children from their communities and prohibiting them from speaking their languages or practicing their traditions. The Indian Wars were only 10 years in the past. In this context, the Bureau of American Ethnology's relationship to the living Native American peoples was deeply ambiguous. The Bureau studied them. It sent representatives to their communities to collect objects and record languages and document traditions. It produced scholarship about them that is, in many ways, genuinely valuable. But it was doing this within a political system that was simultaneously destroying the communities it was studying, and it was doing it on behalf of the state that was conducting that destruction. The Bureau's archaeological work in the mound regions of the Midwest and South was not independent of this context. Every decision about what to collect and what to document and what to publish was made by people operating within a political system that had enormous stakes in the story American archaeology was telling about the pre-Columbian past, and the story it was telling, in 1901, was carefully calibrated. It had moved past the worst excesses of the mound builder myth. It acknowledged that the mounds were built by indigenous peoples, but it maintained a narrative of pre-Columbian North America that emphasized isolation and simplicity in ways that served specific political purposes. The idea of Native American civilizations as genuinely complex, as connected to the broader world, as sophisticated in their intellectual and organizational life, was still more than the dominant cultural framework was prepared to accommodate. This is the context in which the men from the Bureau arrived at Josiah Harmon's farm. Not conspirators engaged in deliberate suppression, perhaps, but agents of an institution operating within a framework that predisposed them to certain interpretations and away from others, trained to see in the Mounds what the institutional framework allowed them to see, and operating with the practical authority to determine what the public record would reflect. Let's follow the objects themselves, hypothetically, from that October day in 1901 forward, because imagining the journey of those objects, even without knowing their ultimate fate, tells us something important about the institutional world they entered. The objects, wrapped and crated, would have been transported to Washington by wagon to the nearest rail line and then by train to the capital. This was the standard procedure. The Bureau's collections went to the National Museum, which is now the National Museum of Natural History, one of the Smithsonian's flagship institutions on the National Mall. Upon arrival in Washington, the objects would have been catalogued into the accession records of the National Museum. Each object would have received an accession number and a catalogue number, and there would have been a brief description of each object and a record of its provenience, its site of origin. The quality of this documentation varied enormously depending on who prepared it. Some Bureau accession records from this period are meticulous. Others are perfunctory to the point of uselessness. The objects would then have been stored. The National Museum's storage facilities in 1901 were not what they are today. The museum was a young institution, rapidly accumulating collections faster than it could process them. Storage was often in crowded conditions with inadequate environmental controls and minimal organization beyond the basic catalogue system. Here is where objects got lost, not necessarily deliberately. The physical chaos of early museum storage, combined with inadequate cataloguing, combined with the turnover of institutional staff over decades, combined with the movement of collections between facilities as the Smithsonian expanded, created conditions in which objects could become practically inaccessible even if they were technically present in the collection. An accession number from 1901 that was recorded in a catalogue now partially damaged by a pipe leak in 1932, an object relocated to a new storage facility in 1947 under a different numbering system. A cross-reference that was never entered, because the staff member responsible left for the war in 1943 and her successor didn't know the filing system. None of this is conspiracy. All of it is chaos. And the result, practically speaking, is the same as deliberate suppression. The objects are there, somewhere, but nobody knows exactly where or what they look like or how significant they are. The Smithsonian's current inventory and cataloguing efforts are, by all accounts, genuinely massive undertakings that are making real progress. The digitization of collection records, the physical inventory of storage facilities, the development of better database systems for connecting accession records to physical objects. All of this is happening. But it is happening against a backdrop of collections that are vast, inadequately documented from decades past, and physically challenging to access and assess. The estimate of 17,000 Native American skeletal remains in the collection is instructive. That number is approximate. The actual number might be higher. Some of those remains were collected with reasonable documentation. Others were collected with almost none. Some can be culturally affiliated with specific tribes. Others cannot, because the documentation of their provenience is too thin to allow meaningful cultural affiliation. NAGPRA requires that culturally affiliated remains be repatriated to the affiliated tribe upon request. But if the documentation doesn't exist to establish cultural affiliation, the legal requirement doesn't kick in. And the documentation often doesn't exist, because the Bureau of American Ethnology and its successor institutions didn't always create the documentation in the first place. This is where the Smithsonian's responsibility to the legacy of its 19th and early 20th century collecting is most acute. Not just that it holds the objects, that it holds them without the documentation that would allow their proper attribution and their eventual return to the communities they came from. And this responsibility is not being discharged with the urgency it deserves. Let's look at some numbers. NAGPRA passed in 1990. As of the most recent reporting, the Smithsonian has repatriated somewhere in the range of 5,000 sets of remains and 30,000 associated funerary objects. That sounds like a significant number. But set against 17,000 sets of remains in the collection, it means that more than 10,000 sets of human remains are still held by the institution, more than 30 years after the law was passed requiring their repatriation when culturally affiliated. The reasons given for the slow pace of repatriation are various. The inadequacy of the original documentation, the complexity of establishing cultural affiliation for remains collected a century and more ago, the resources required for the consultation process with tribal nations, the legal complexity of cases where multiple tribes may have claims. All of these are real issues. None of them fully explain why more than 30 years after the passage of a law designed to address this exact situation, more than 10,000 sets of Native American remains are still in the Smithsonian's collection. Josiah Harmon's stone chamber, if it contained what he described, contained human remains. Remains that, if they were taken in 1901 and are still in the Smithsonian's collection, have not been repatriated, have not been returned to the earth, which is where the Hopewell tradition placed them, have not been acknowledged as the ancestors of living communities who have the right to determine their fate. These are the stakes that the story of Josiah Harmon's mound connects to, not just the missing tablets, not just the suppressed evidence of possible pre-Columbian writing or unusual material culture. The question of what happened to the bones of people who were buried with ceremony 1,500 years ago and who were dug up and packed into crates and transported to Washington and have been in institutional storage ever since. This matters. It matters independently of whatever else the chamber contained. The bones matter. There are other dimensions of the broader story that we haven't yet fully explored, dimensions that connect the Ohio Mounds to a continental and even a global picture that is still being assembled. One of the most intriguing recent developments in the archaeology of pre-Columbian North America is the work being done on what might be called the American maritime traditions. The question of how people got to the Americas in the first place, and how they moved around within the Americas once they were here, is being significantly revised by recent evidence. The oldest definitive evidence for human presence in the Americas is from before 15,000 years ago, based on several sites that have received rigorous dating. The Clovis tradition, once thought to represent the first Americans, is now understood to postdate the earliest arrivals. Who came before the Clovis people, by what routes, and from where, is still being worked out. The Pacific Coast hypothesis, the idea that some of the earliest Americans arrived by boat along the Pacific coast rather than through an inland ice-free corridor, is gaining traction with multiple lines of evidence. If this hypothesis is correct, and the evidence increasingly suggests it is at least partially correct, then the Americas were settled from the beginning by people who were capable of sustained maritime activity, people who had boats and navigation skills, and the organizational capacity to sustain multiple generations of coastal migration. This changes the baseline assumption about what pre-Columbian North American peoples were capable of. If your ancestors arrived by boat along the Pacific coast 15,000 or more years ago, then maritime traditions are part of your deepest cultural inheritance. The idea that pre-Columbian North American peoples were exclusively land-based cultures with no capacity for significant maritime activity needs to be revised against this background. And in fact, we know that maritime traditions were important in pre-Columbian North America. The shell-midden cultures of the Pacific Northwest and the Gulf Coast maintained sophisticated maritime economies for thousands of years. The peoples of the Pacific Northwest developed among the most complex non-agricultural societies in human history, based on the extraordinary productivity of the coastal fisheries. The peoples of the Gulf Coast maintained trade networks that connected interior regions to the coast and that moved goods both by land and by water. The question of whether any of these maritime traditions included the capacity for long-distance ocean voyaging, the kind of voyaging that would have allowed contact between North America and the Pacific or the Atlantic, is still open. The Polynesian evidence for trans-Pacific contact with South America suggests that at least that direction of contact was possible in the pre-Columbian period. Whether similar contact occurred further north, whether the peoples of the Pacific Northwest or the Gulf Coast or the Atlantic seaboard of North America had any contact with distant maritime cultures, is a question that the evidence has not yet answered. And this is a question that could potentially bear on the kinds of anomalous finds reported from the mounds. If any of the objects described as resembling Old World material culture were genuine, the most plausible explanation for their presence in a North American mound context would not be ancient astronauts or Atlantis, but maritime trade. Objects moving along trade networks that extended further than the standard model acknowledges. This is speculative. The evidence for it is not currently strong, but the framework for thinking about it is more legitimate than the alternative history versions of the same question. The pre-Columbian Americas were not sealed from the rest of the world by some impermeable barrier. The peopling of the Americas happened by crossing water. The movement of peoples and objects within the Americas included substantial maritime components. The question of whether any of that maritime activity extended to connections with the rest of the world is a legitimate archaeological question, even if the current evidence suggests the answer is mostly no. In that context, the objects in Josiah Harmon's chamber, whatever they were, deserve to be evaluated not against the simple model of isolated woodland cultures, but against the more complex model of a continent with deep maritime traditions and extensive trade networks, and an intellectual and cultural life of genuine complexity. The tablets, if they were real. The copper panels with unusual imagery, if they were real. These deserve to be evaluated with the full toolkit of modern archaeological analysis, including comparison with material from across the Atlantic and Pacific worlds, as well as within North America. Not because the answer is necessarily going to be that they show connections to distant cultures, but because the question should be asked rather than foreclosed. That foreclosure, that institutional unwillingness to take certain questions seriously, is part of what the story of Josiah Harmon's Mound is about. The foreclosure operated in 1901, when the Bureau arrived and collected the objects and dismissed the account of a farmer who said he'd found something remarkable. It continues to operate today, when the alternative history framing of similar questions makes it difficult for mainstream archaeology to engage with them seriously, without appearing to validate claims that it regards as unsupported. The way out of this bind is not to pretend that the alternative history claims are more credible than they are. It is to actually do the work. To make the collections accessible, to do the systematic analysis, to follow the evidence where it leads, rather than assigning it in advance to the category of the ordinary or the category of the sensational. The objects in the Smithsonian's collection from the Mound regions of North America represent a significant portion of the physical evidence about pre-Columbian North American civilization. Some of that evidence has been properly analyzed and published. A significant portion of it has not been. And the gap between what has been analyzed and what has not corresponds, with uncomfortable frequency, to the categories of finds that would be most interesting if they turned out to be what the anomalous accounts suggest they might be. This correspondence might be coincidence. The gap might reflect nothing more than the ordinary priorities of a scientific institution with too much material and too few resources. But in the absence of the kind of systematic, transparent, publicly accessible analysis that would resolve the question, the gap remains a gap. The questions remain questions. And the story that fills the gap, whether it is Josiah Harmon's account or the broader alternative history tradition that has grown up around similar accounts, is going to be told by someone. The choice is not between a story and no story. The choice is between an accurate story built on actual evidence and an inaccurate story built on speculation and institutional silence. And the way to get the accurate story is to do the work, to open the collections, to do the analysis, to publish the results, to engage with the descendant communities as partners in interpretation rather than obstacles to research. This is not being asked as a favor. It is being asked as an obligation. An obligation to the physical legacy of extraordinary civilizations. An obligation to the descendant communities whose ancestors built that legacy. An obligation to the public who are entitled to an honest account of the history of the continent they live on. The stone chamber in Josiah Harmon's field was built by people who understood something about the relationship between the living and the dead, between the human community and the powers of the universe, between the particular and the eternal, that we still don't fully comprehend. Whatever was in that chamber was put there with intention, with ceremony, with the full weight of a spiritual and intellectual tradition that had been developed over many generations and that understood the world in ways that our models of pre-Columbian North American culture still don't adequately capture. The recovery of that understanding is not going to happen through the dramatic revelation of suppressed evidence. It is going to happen through patient, careful, collaborative work. Through the integration of archaeological evidence and living traditions, through the application of modern analytical methods to collections that have been waiting in storage for over a century, through the honest acknowledgement of what the institutional record does and does not tell us. It is going to require the kind of intellectual humility that says, we thought we knew the story, but the story is more complex than we thought, and the evidence that would help us understand that complexity deserves to be properly examined. And it is going to require the kind of institutional accountability that says, we collected this evidence. We are responsible for it. We owe it to the people whose ancestors made it and to the public on whose behalf we hold it, to make it accessible, and to be honest about what we know and what we don't know. This is what Josiah Harman was asking for when he told his story for 30 years. Not a dramatic revelation, an honest account. The acknowledgement that something remarkable had happened on his property, and that the people with the authority to document it had instead collected it and fallen silent. He never got that acknowledgement. His grandson never got it. And the question of what was in that stone chamber in Ohio in 1901 has never been publicly answered. But the question endures. Questions like this always endure. They outlast the people who first asked them. They outlast the institutions that tried to silence them. They outlast the political contexts that made the silence seem necessary. They endure because the truth endures. Because the physical reality of what was in that chamber, whatever it was, is still there, somewhere, in some form. And because the physical reality of what was built on this continent before the history books began is still there, in the soil and in the earthworks and in the collections and in the living traditions of the descendant communities. The truth about pre-Columbian North America is a remarkable truth. It does not need embellishment. It does not need the intervention of ancient astronauts or the validation of lost white civilizations. It is extraordinary enough on its own terms. The mounds of the Hopewell and the Mississippian and the ancestral Puebloan and the people of Poverty Point and all the other cultures that built the monumental landscape of pre-Columbian North America represent one of the great chapters in the history of human civilization. They deserve to be known in their full complexity and their full achievement. They deserve to have the evidence about them properly preserved and examined and communicated. They deserve to have the descendant communities recognized as living heirs of that achievement rather than as obstacles to the study of it. And the story of Josiah Harman's mound, small as it is in the scale of the full picture, deserves to be told as part of that larger story. As one small piece of the ongoing reckoning with what this continent contains and what the institutions of the United States owe to the truth about it. The silence began on a Tuesday morning in 1901. It has lasted long enough. The conversation that was interrupted when the men in suits arrived needs to resume. The objects that were taken need to be accounted for. The questions that Josiah Harman spent 30 years asking need answers. And the truth about what was built on this continent before the history books began needs to be told in full, honestly, with the evidence, without embellishment, without suppression, without the political filters that have distorted it for a century and a half. That truth is out there, in the soil of Ohio and across the eastern half of this continent, in the collections and the archives and the storage rooms of institutions that have held it imperfectly and incompletely for too long, in the oral traditions of communities that have maintained their connection to it through centuries of disruption and suppression. It is there. It is waiting. It has been waiting for a long time. The mound is gone, but what was in it endures, somewhere. And the people who built the mound, and the civilization they were part of, and the extraordinary human story they represent, endure in their descendants, and in the physical record they left behind, and in the questions that their achievement still raises, and in the silence that has surrounded those questions for far too long. Josiah Harman knew this, in his own way, without the vocabulary of archaeology or the framework of professional history. He knew that something important had been in that field, and that something important had been taken, and that the taking and the silence that followed were wrong. He was right. And the ending this story is waiting for, the ending that Josiah Harman never lived to see, is not a sensational revelation but a simple accounting, an honest answer to the question he asked for 30 years. What was in that stone chamber, and what happened to it, and why was the world not allowed to know? That question deserves an answer. The silence has lasted long enough. There is another layer to this story that we have not yet fully explored. A layer that connects what happened on Josiah Harman's farm to a much larger pattern of land and power, and the particular way that American institutions have related to the physical legacy of the people whose land was taken. When European colonization began in earnest in North America, the mounds were already ancient. The Hopewell culture had ended perhaps 1,000 years before Columbus. The Mississippian culture was still active in some regions when the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, and it persisted in modified forms into the 17th and 18th centuries. But the great earthwork complexes of Ohio, the Newark and Chillicothe systems, were already ruins by the time the first European explorers saw them. The European colonizers encountered the mounds as mysterious objects in the landscape, objects that didn't fit into the conceptual framework they brought with them from the Old World. They had categories for ancient monuments in Europe, for the ruins of Rome and the earthworks of Britain and the stone circles of France. But those categories were for monuments that belonged to civilizations they knew about, civilizations that were ancestral to European culture in one way or another. The mounds were different. They were monuments of civilizations that the colonizers had no category for, civilizations that were neither classical nor barbarian in the European sense, civilizations whose descendants were the people that the colonizers were simultaneously fighting, trading with, enslaving, and converting. The cognitive dissonance this produced was immense, and the resolution of that dissonance, the mound builder myth, was a product of the need to make the mounds fit into a framework that served the interests of the colonizing society. If the mounds had been built by the ancestors of the people the colonizers were displacing, then the land on which they sat was a landscape rich with human history and cultural meaning to those people. The destruction of the mounds would be the destruction of a living culture's historical monuments. The displacement of the mound builders' descendants would be the displacement of people from the landscape their ancestors had shaped over thousands of years. But if the mounds had been built by some other, earlier people, a lost race that had been displaced by the Native Americans before European arrival, then the colonizers were just the latest in a long series of conquerors. The land had no special claim on those who currently lived there. The mounds were historical curiosities rather than living cultural monuments, and the destruction of both the mounds and the communities that descended from their builders was just the ordinary churn of history. This is why the mound builder myth persisted so long and was so widely embraced. It was not just a theory about the past, it was a justification for the present. And when John Wesley Powell's Bureau of American Ethnology definitively debunked it in the 1880s, the cultural work that it had been doing didn't simply stop. The myth was replaced in the official record, but the underlying need it served didn't disappear. What replaced the myth, in the institutional culture of American archaeology and the Bureau of American Ethnology, was something more subtle. Not a claim that the mounds were built by a lost white race, but a framing of the mound builders' civilization as fundamentally simpler and less sophisticated than it actually was. A narrative that acknowledged the Native American authorship of the mounds while simultaneously minimizing the achievement they represented. That attributed the earthworks to simple religious impulses rather than sophisticated intellectual and organizational systems. That emphasized the isolation of pre-Columbian North American cultures rather than their connectivity. That framed the mound builders as primitive ancestors of the living Native Americans rather than as the founders of genuine civilizations. This framing served some of the same political purposes as the mound builder myth, without the intellectual embarrassment of claiming that the mounds were built by a race unconnected to the living Native American peoples. It kept the achievement of the mound builders at a level that didn't challenge the narrative of Native American primitivism that the colonizing society required. It maintained a picture of pre-Columbian North America as a land of simple woodland peoples who left no legacy worthy of comparison to the civilizations of the Old World. And in this context, any evidence that challenged this framing, any evidence of writing systems or sophisticated metallurgy or long-distance maritime connections or architectural achievement beyond the simple accumulation of earth was evidence that the institutional framework was predisposed to minimize or suppress, not through conspiracy. Through the ordinary operation of a paradigm that was shaped by political interests as surely as by scientific evidence, Josiah Harman's tablets, if they were what he described, were a direct challenge to this framing. A writing system in a pre-Columbian North American mound context, especially one that appeared to an untrained observer to resemble an organized script, was the kind of thing that the institutional framework of American archaeology in 1901 was not equipped to handle honestly, because honesty about it would have required asking questions that the framework wasn't prepared to ask. Not just about the specific tablets, but about the whole picture of pre-Columbian North American civilization that the tablets were a piece of. About whether the mound builders were more complex, more literate, more connected to a wider world than the narrative allowed. Those questions are still not being asked with the full rigor and the full transparency that they deserve. Not because the individual archaeologists working in the field today are dishonest. Most of them are deeply committed to following the evidence wherever it leads. But because the institutional structures within which they work, the publishing systems and the funding systems and the collection access systems and the professional norms that govern what counts as legitimate inquiry still carry the weight of a history in which those questions were systematically discouraged. The full intellectual liberation of the archaeology of pre-Columbian North America, the kind of liberation that would allow the questions to be asked and the evidence to be examined and the story to be told in its full complexity is still ahead of us. It requires not just individual intellectual courage, but institutional reform, the opening of the collections, the improvement of the documentation, the genuine partnership with descendant communities, the willingness to follow the evidence, even when it leads to conclusions that challenge established narratives. This is what the story of Josiah Harman's Mound is ultimately about. Not the specific objects in the specific chamber. The need for the kind of honest, thorough, institutionally supported inquiry that would allow questions like the ones the chamber raises to be properly answered. That need has been present since 1901. Since before 1901, since the first European settler looked at a mound and tried to make sense of it. And it is still present today. The mounds are still there. The questions are still there. The collections are still in storage. And the silence, after 120 years, is still asking to be broken. Let's talk for a moment about what happened after Powell's official debunking of the mound builder myth, because the aftermath is instructive. Powell's 1881 report was a landmark document. It systematically reviewed the evidence for the various competing claims about who built the mounds and concluded, on the basis of that evidence, that the mounds were built by the ancestors of living Native American peoples. It was the right conclusion based on the available evidence, argued with genuine rigor. But the report's reception outside the professional archaeological community was not what Powell might have hoped. The popular appetite for the mound builder myth was not satisfied by scientific debunking. The books continued to be published. The lectures continued to be given. The idea of a lost white race or a lost Israelite civilization or an Atlantean colony in the American Midwest continued to circulate in popular culture throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And within the professional community, while the explicit mound builder myth was rejected, the underlying assumptions it reflected, the assumption that the mound builders were less sophisticated than the evidence actually suggested, the assumption that pre-Columbian North America was culturally isolated from the rest of the world, the assumption that Native American traditions couldn't tell us much about the mound builders' cosmological system because the connection between the historical tribes and the ancient builders was too tenuous or too transformed to be reliable, these assumptions persisted. They persisted in the way that assumptions always persist, by operating below the level of conscious examination, by shaping what questions were asked and what questions weren't asked, by influencing what interpretations were published and what interpretations were kept in private speculation, by determining what kinds of evidence were taken seriously and what kinds were dismissed as anomalous. The alternative history tradition that has grown up around the mounds is, in significant part, a response to this persistence. A recognition, often intuitive and often poorly articulated, that the official narrative is not telling the whole story. A reaching for explanations that can account for what the official narrative leaves out. The tragedy is that the alternative history tradition mostly reaches in the wrong direction. It reaches for ancient astronauts and lost white races, because those are the frameworks it has inherited from the 19th century and from the popular culture that the mound builder myth generated. It is reaching for an explanation of genuine anomalies, genuine gaps in the official narrative, using tools that are themselves a product of the distortions in that narrative. The better response to the genuine gaps in the official narrative is not to fill them with fantastical claims, but to demand that the institutions responsible for the official narrative do the work required to close those gaps, honestly, to make the collections accessible, to do the systematic analysis, to engage with the descendant communities, to publish results that follow the evidence rather than the paradigm. This is not a romantic request. It is a practical one, and it is one that the story of Josiah Harman's Mound, told in its full context, helps to make. Because Josiah Harman's story is a specific, concrete example of what institutional failure looks like. A man found something. Officials arrived. The objects were taken. The story was suppressed. The objects disappeared from the public record. The question of what they were and what they meant has never been publicly addressed. This happened. It was wrong. And the institution responsible for it, the Smithsonian Institution, in the form of its Bureau of American Ethnology, has never publicly acknowledged that it happened or accounted for what it took. That acknowledgement and that accounting are what justice looks like in this context. Not a dramatic revelation, not the unlocking of a secret warehouse, just the honest acknowledgement that objects were taken from a farm in Ohio in 1901, and that those objects have never been publicly described, and that the man who found them spent 30 years trying to make sure the world knew. about them, and that his story deserves to be taken seriously. And then the work. The actual work of finding out what the Bureau took from that field in October 1901, and what happened to it, whether it is still in the Smithsonian's collection, whether it was catalogued and if so, under what description, whether it has ever been analysed, whether the analysis produced results that were published or results that were not. This work is possible. The accession records from 1901 still exist, in whatever form. The field reports from Bureau activities in eastern Ohio in the early 1900s still exist, in whatever form. The original catalogue of the National Museum's collections from that period still exists, in whatever form. Someone with time and institutional access and a determination to follow the thread could potentially find the record of what was taken from Josiah Harmon's farm, could potentially find the objects themselves, or find out what happened to them, could potentially answer the question that Josiah Harmon spent 30 years asking, that someone has not yet emerged, or if they have emerged, their work has not yet been completed or publicly shared. But the possibility exists. The record may be there, and the story of what happened on that farm in 1901 is worth pursuing all the way to whatever answer the record holds. Even if the answer turns out to be deeply ordinary, even if the objects turn out to be typical Hopewell material catalogued under vague descriptions that have been sitting in a storage drawer since 1902, even if the tablets turn out to be decorated stones whose markings are unusual but not inexplicable within known Hopewell decorative traditions, even then, the process of finding out is worth something, because the honest, thorough, publicly documented investigation of what happened in that field in 1901 would be a model of what American archaeology owes to the physical legacy it holds and to the public on whose behalf it holds it. And if the answer turns out to be something more than ordinary, if the tablets are what Josiah Harmon thought they were, if the copper panels really do bear unusual imagery, if the skeletal remains really were of individuals outside the normal range, then the process of finding that out, and of making it public, and of honestly assessing what it means in the full context of what we know about pre-Columbian North American civilization, is the kind of work that the archaeology of this continent has been waiting for someone to do properly for a very long time. Either way, the story deserves an ending. Not the ending of a dramatic conspiracy thriller, the ending of an honest inquiry, the ending where the questions get answered, the evidence gets examined, the institutions account for what they hold, and the story of what was built on this continent before the history books began gets told with the honesty and the fullness it deserves. That ending is still ahead of us, but the story of Josiah Harmon's Mound is part of the path toward it, and the silence that has surrounded that story for 120 years is part of what needs to end before we can get there. The mound is gone, the chamber is gone, the men in suits are gone, Josiah Harmon is gone, but the questions endure. And somewhere, in the Smithsonian or in an Ohio field or in the deep institutional memory of a country still reckoning with its own history, the answers are waiting. They have been waiting for a long time. They are patient, but they are not endless. And the silence is not endless either. It never is. The last question this story has to ask is the one that the story has been circling around from the beginning without quite arriving at directly. The question is not really about Josiah Harmon, though it is told through his story. It is not really about the Smithsonian, though the Smithsonian's behaviour is central to it. It is not even really about the tablets or the copper panels or the skeletal remains in the stone chamber, though those are the specific objects that crystallise the larger issue. The last question is this: what do we owe to the past? Not what do institutions owe to the evidence, though that is part of it. What do we, as people living on this continent, as citizens of a country that sits on land that was shaped by human civilization for thousands of years before the first European arrived, owe to the full, honest story of what happened here? This is not an abstract philosophical question. It has concrete dimensions. It means asking what we owe to the 17,000 sets of human remains sitting in institutional storage. It means asking what we owe to the objects in the collections that have never been properly described or made publicly accessible. It means asking what we owe to the descendant communities whose ancestors made those objects and left those remains. It means asking what we owe to the broader public understanding of the continent's pre-Columbian history. And it means asking what we owe to the specific, concrete, unresolved question of what was in a stone chamber in Ohio in 1901 and what happened to it. These debts are not abstract. They are real. And they have been accumulating for a long time. The Hopewell people who built the stone chamber that Josiah Harmon found were not primitive. They were not simple. They were not the inhabitants of a landscape that was essentially empty and unhistoried before the Europeans arrived. They were the products of a civilization that had been developing on this continent for thousands of years, that had created trade networks and ceremonial systems and intellectual traditions of genuine sophistication, that had left their mark on the landscape in ways that are still visible and still astonishing. They built that stone chamber as part of a tradition of honoring their dead and their significant members with the creation of a physical space that could carry meaning across generations. They put objects in it that mattered to them, objects that represented their values and their connections and their understanding of the world. They sealed it and piled earth over it and left it to endure, and it endured. For 1,500 years, it endured. Through the collapse of the Hopewell network and the emergence of the late woodland cultures and the rise of the Mississippian civilization and the colonization of the continent and the century of development that ploughed over most of what remained of the Hopewell earthwork landscape, it endured until Josiah Harmon's shovel broke through the surface in 1901. For those 1,500 years, the stone chamber was doing exactly what its builders intended it to do, holding the physical legacy of a significant moment in the life of a community, preserving it against the erosion of time, waiting for the moment when it would be found. That moment arrived in 1901, and what happened with it? The arrival of the men in suits, the systematic removal and crating of the contents, the silence that followed, was not what the builders of the chamber intended. They did not build it so that its contents could disappear into an institutional warehouse. They built it so that what it contained would endure, would be known, would be understood. The debt to that intention is part of what we owe to the past. We owe the builders of that chamber an honest accounting of what became of what they left behind. We owe their descendants the same accounting. We owe the public the full story of what was found there and what happened to it. And we owe ourselves, as people who live on this land and who are shaped by its history, whether we know it or not, the honesty to reckon with the fact that the history of this continent is older and more complex and more extraordinary than we have been told. The mound is gone. What it contained is somewhere else, or gone entirely. The silence has lasted 120 years, but the debt endures, and debts that endure eventually demand payment. This one is overdue. The story of Josiah Harmon and the stone chamber in his field is not the whole story. It is not even a large part of the whole story. It is a small, specific, local instance of a pattern that runs through the entire relationship between American institutions and the physical legacy of pre-Columbian North American civilization. But small, specific local instances are how patterns become visible. They are how abstract institutional failures become concrete human stories. They are how the accumulated weight of a century of silence begins to become audible. Josiah Harmon's story is audible now. It has been preserved, imperfectly, through the dedication of his grandson and the accident of a fire that destroyed the newspaper editor's notes, but not the family's own record. It is part of the larger conversation about what this continent contains and what we owe to the truth about it. That conversation is happening, slowly, imperfectly, in fits and starts, with too few resources and too much political resistance and too many competing agendas. But it is happening. And the story of what was found in a field in Ohio in 1901 and taken away before the world could know about it is part of what makes it happen. Josiah Harmon spent 30 years telling his story. His grandson spent 40 years trying to find out what happened next. Now the story is out here, in the world, asking to be continued. The question of what was in that stone chamber deserves an answer. The silence deserves to end. And the civilization that built the chamber, and the living communities that descend from it, and the extraordinary human story of pre-Columbian North America that the chamber was a small piece of, deserve to be known in full. That is what Josiah Harmon was asking for when he sent his son into town to find the newspaper editor on that Tuesday evening in 1901, before the men in suits arrived, before the silence began. He was asking for the simple, basic acknowledgement that something remarkable had happened on his land, that the world deserved to know about it, that the truth had a right to be told. He was right then. He is right now. The silence is not the answer. The truth is the answer. And the truth about what was in that stone chamber in Ohio in 1901 is still out there, somewhere, waiting to be found. It has been waiting for 120 years. But truths like this do not disappear. They wait. They persist. They endure, like the mounds themselves, beyond the particular moment that created them, beyond the political context that shaped the response to them, beyond the institutional silences that surrounded them. They wait for the moment when someone is ready to hear them. That moment is now. The mound is gone, but the story remains, and the story is asking the question that it has always been asking. What was in the stone chamber? What happened to it? And why was the world not allowed to know? These questions have waited 120 years. They have waited long enough. The answer is somewhere, and it deserves to be found. For Josiah Harmon, who found the chamber and lost it in the same week. For his grandson, who spent 40 years trying to find out what happened. For the Hopewell people who built the chamber 1,500 years ago and whose descendants are still here, still waiting for the full accounting of what was taken from the ground that their ancestors shaped. For the truth, which endures, as it always does, beyond the silence, beyond the institutional fog, beyond the 120 years of waiting. The truth endures, and someday someone is going to find it. On that day, the silence that began on a Tuesday morning in Ohio in 1901 will finally, properly, fully, and honestly end. Until then, the mound speaks in its absence, the chamber speaks in its emptiness. And Josiah Harmon speaks in his story, which has survived when so much else has not. That story is here. It is waiting. And it is worth more than the silence that has surrounded it. The truth always is. There is a specific road in eastern Ohio that runs through country that was once dotted with Hopewell earthworks, and if you drive it in early autumn, when the light comes in at the angle that reveals the old landscape features, you can sometimes see the ghost lines in the fields, the slight depressions where earthen walls once stood, the barely visible ridges where mounds were ploughed down over the course of a century of farming, the faint marks of an ancient landscape that was once as intentional and as carefully organized as any planned city. Most people who drive that road don't see any of this. They see farmland. Flat, productive working farmland with grain elevators in the distance and the occasional barn and the utility poles strung along the roadside. The ghost lines in the fields require the right angle of light and a certain kind of attentiveness. An attentiveness shaped by knowing what you're looking for. This is the situation that American archaeology faces with the pre-Columbian past of North America more broadly. The evidence is there, in the landscape and in the collections and in the archives and in the living traditions of the descendant communities. But it requires the right kind of attentiveness to see it. An attentiveness that has been in short supply for a long time, shaped by a history in which the political and institutional incentives all pointed away from looking carefully. The story of what happened in the American Midwest in the centuries before European contact is one of the most extraordinary stories of human achievement and human creativity and human organization that this planet has to offer. It is a story that has been systematically undervalued and systematically suppressed and systematically distorted for reasons that had everything to do with politics and nothing to do with science. The mounds that remain are monuments to that achievement. They are also monuments to the failure to adequately acknowledge it, because their survival has been so contingent, so dependent on luck and on the decisions of individual landowners rather than on the systematic protection that they deserved. And the objects that were taken from the mounds that didn't survive, the objects that went into institutional collections and private collections and the hands of dealers and the inventory of auction houses, represent a different kind of monument. A monument to the failure of the institutions charged with preserving the past to do so with the rigor and the transparency and the respect that the past demanded. Josiah Harmon's stone chamber is one small piece of this, one small, specific, documented instance of a large and systematic failure. But it is a piece that carries the full weight of the larger story, because it is specific and human and irreducible. It is about a real man who found a real thing and was prevented from sharing it with the world. It is about real objects that went into real institutional storage and have never been publicly accounted for. It is about real questions that have been waiting 120 years for honest answers. The attentiveness required to see the ghost lines in the Ohio fields is the same attentiveness required to see this story clearly, to see it without the distortions of the alternative history frameworks that have claimed it, and without the defensive dismissiveness that those frameworks tend to generate in the professional community. To see it as what it is, a specific instance of a systemic problem, a problem that has a history and a present and a path toward resolution. That path is not dramatic. It is not revealed through a single sensational discovery. It runs through the patient work of archival research and collection inventory, and collaborative engagement with descendant communities and transparent communication of results. It runs through the willingness of institutions to acknowledge what they hold and to account for it honestly. It runs through the willingness of the broader public to demand that accounting. It is, in other words, the path of ordinary scholarly integrity, of basic institutional responsibility, of the commitment to truth that should characterize any institution claiming the authority to preserve and interpret the human past. That commitment has not always been present. The story of Josiah Harmon's Mound is evidence of that. The story of the 17,000 skeletal remains in Smithsonian storage is evidence of that. The story of the Pocola Mining Company's destruction of Spiro is evidence of that. But the commitment can be renewed. It can be made real in the present, even if it was absent in the past. And the story of Josiah Harmon's Mound, told honestly and pursued to whatever conclusion the evidence allows, is one way of beginning to make it real. Let's end, as we began, in eastern Ohio in the autumn. But let's end not in 1901, but now. The field where Josiah Harmon's Mound once stood is still there. It is still being farmed. The soil is still dark and rich, mixed now with the residue of a century of agricultural amendments and a century of root systems and a century of earthworm activity. The northwest corner of the property, where the mound once stood, is indistinguishable from the rest of the field. But the soil remembers. Soil always does. A geophysical survey of that corner of the field would reveal something. The compressed earth that was once the mound's core, the disturbed soil where the chamber was dismantled, the traces of the clay-lined walls, the ghostly signature of a structure that was built with care and filled with intention and stood for 15 centuries and was emptied in 4 days. The objects that were taken from it are somewhere, or they are gone. The record of what was taken may exist in some form in the Bureau of American Ethnology's archives, or in the National Museum's accession records, or in the field notes of the men who conducted the excavation. The questions that Josiah Harmon asked are still questions. The silence that began when the men in suits arrived is still silence. But silence is not permanent. It is not the natural state of things. It is a condition that was created and that can be ended. The ending of this particular silence requires someone to do the work, to go into the Smithsonian's archives, to trace the Bureau's activities in eastern Ohio in October 1901, to find the accession records, to find the objects, if they exist, to bring them into the public record. That work has not been done. Not completely, not publicly, but it could be done. And the story of what happened on Josiah Harmon's farm, preserved through his grandson's dedication and now part of the broader conversation about the pre-Columbian past of North America, is part of what makes it possible to call for that work to be done. Not in the voice of conspiracy theory, not in the language of ancient astronauts or lost white races, in the plain language of institutional accountability. We took these objects from this field on this date. Here is what we found. Here is what we did with it. Here is where it is now. Here is what it tells us about the civilization that created it. That is the statement the Smithsonian has never made about Josiah Harmon's find. That is the statement that has been waiting to be made for 120 years. It is still waiting. The field is still there. The questions are still there. The silence is still there. But the silence is also still a silence that can be broken. And in the breaking of it, in the honest, public, fully documented accounting of what was in that stone chamber and what happened to it, is the ending that Josiah Harmon's story has been waiting for. An ending built not on sensationalism, but on truth. An ending that acknowledges what was found, what was taken, and what we owe to the civilization that created it. An ending worthy of the people who built the chamber, worthy of the man who found it, worthy of the 120 years of waiting. The silence has lasted long enough. The truth is ready. And somewhere, in a field in Ohio, in the dark earth of the northwest corner of a farm, in the memory of the landscape itself, the answer is there, waiting, as it has always been, patient as the earth, older than the silence, ready to be heard. There is one final thing worth saying about the specific character of what the Hopewell people created, because it bears directly on why the contents of Josiah Harmon's stone chamber mattered enough for someone to arrive before the world could know about it. The Hopewell people were not simply constructing burial mounds. They were constructing a cosmology, a physical representation of their understanding of how the universe worked and what the human community's place in it was. The earthworks were not just monuments to the dead. They were maps of a spiritual geography, instruments for aligning the human community with the powers of the cosmos, technologies for maintaining right relationship between the visible world and the invisible world that the Hopewell tradition understood to underlie it. When you look at the Newark earthworks from above, as the aerial surveys now allow us to do, you see something that is simultaneously a geometric feat, an astronomical instrument, a ceremonial landscape, and a statement about the relationship between human order and cosmic order. The circles and octagons and parallel walls are not decorative. They are functional. They align with the movements of the moon and the sun. They define spaces for ceremony that are themselves cosmologically meaningful. They represent the intellectual achievement of a people who had spent generations observing the sky and thinking about what it meant and encoding their understanding of it in the most permanent medium available to them, which was the earth itself. The stone chamber that Josiah Harmon found was part of this, a component of the local expression of a cosmological tradition that extended across the Hopewell network. The objects in it, the tablets and the copper panels and the vessels and the human remains on the central platform, were part of a ceremony that was itself part of a larger ordering of the world. They were not treasure in the simple sense of accumulated wealth. They were instruments and symbols of a spiritual and intellectual tradition whose full complexity we still don't understand. This is what was taken from that field in 1901. Not just objects, an intelligible piece of a cosmological system, a piece that, properly documented and properly analysed in its full context, might have contributed to our understanding of what the Hopewell tradition actually was, what it understood, what it was trying to do. That contribution was not made, because the objects were removed from their context and placed in storage, and never publicly described, because the context itself was destroyed when the chamber was dismantled, because the record of what was found was never made part of the public scholarship of American archaeology. This is the deepest loss, not the specific objects. The contribution to understanding that was foreclosed when the objects were taken and the silence descended. That contribution cannot now be fully recovered. The context is gone. Whatever the tablet said, whatever the copper panels depicted, whatever the arrangement of objects in the chamber signified, can only be partially reconstructed from Josiah Harmon's non-specialist description and from whatever internal documentation the Bureau may have created. But partial recovery is better than no recovery. The contribution that cannot be fully made can still be partially made, if someone does the work of finding what remains of the record and making it public. And the broader contribution to understanding, the contribution to an honest and complete picture of what the Hopewell people created and what it meant, is still available through the study of the sites and objects that are in the public record, if we approach them with the attention and the respect they deserve. The Hopewell cosmological tradition was one of the great intellectual achievements of the ancient world. The physical expressions of it that survive, the earthworks and the objects in the public collections and the astronomical knowledge encoded in the alignments, are remarkable by any standard of human achievement. They deserve to be understood in their full significance, not minimized into simple religious impulses or primitive ritual practices. They deserve the same attention and the same respect that we give to the monuments of the old world civilizations, the same curiosity, the same seriousness of inquiry, the same commitment to following the evidence wherever it leads. The people who built them were fully human, fully intelligent, fully capable of the kind of sustained intellectual and organizational effort that the earthworks represent. They were not primitive, they were not simple, they were our ancestors, in the deepest sense, because they were part of the human story that produced us, and they were living on the same continent that we live on now, shaping the same landscape, building a civilization that has left its mark on the physical world even after 1,500 years of transformation and neglect. They deserve better than the silence that has surrounded their achievement for so long. And the work of ending that silence, the honest, patient, rigorous, collaborative work of understanding and communicating what they built and what it meant, is the work that the story of Josiah Harmon's Mound is calling for. That work begins by asking the questions, by refusing to accept the silence as the final word, by insisting that the institutions responsible for the record account for what they hold, what was in the stone chamber, what happened to it. The questions endure, the answers are waiting, the silence cannot last forever. The Ohio sky in autumn is a particular shade of grey-blue that has not changed since the Hopewell people looked up at it from the floors of their earthwork enclosures 1,500 years ago. The hawks still circle on the thermals above the river valleys. The light still comes in low and long in the late afternoon, casting the shadows that reveal the ghost lines in the old fields. The creek still runs through the eastern part of the county where Josiah Harmon's farm once sat. The landscape holds more history than it is generally given credit for. It holds the memory of a civilization that shaped it with intention and care over many generations. It holds the memory of what was found there, and what was taken, and what was lost in the taking. It holds the memory of a man who spent 30 years trying to make sure the world knew what he had found. And it holds the question that has been waiting since October 1901, when a shovel struck stone in the northwest corner of a farm in eastern Ohio, and the stone gave way and the light fell into a chamber that had been sealed for 15 centuries, and something began to emerge that was, by every account, remarkable. The question endures. The answer is somewhere. The silence has lasted long enough. The full story of pre-Columbian North America has never been told completely. It has been told in fragments, in the official publications of institutions that held only part of the evidence and published only part of what they held. It has been told in distortions through the frameworks of the Mound builder myth and its 20th century successors. It has been told in silences, in the gaps in the official record where the anomalous and the inconvenient and the politically uncomfortable were quietly filed away, but the full story is there. It is in the earthworks that remain, and in the collections that have never been fully described, and in the oral traditions of the descendant communities, and in the archives that have never been fully searched, and in the soil of this continent that holds more human history than most of us have ever been taught to recognize. That story is worth telling, all of it, honestly, with the full weight of the evidence and the full acknowledgement of what the evidence does and does not allow us to conclude, with the voices of the descendant communities included as essential participants rather than peripheral informants, with the institutional accountability that the record of collecting and suppressing and silencing demands. The mound in eastern Ohio is gone, but the story is not. It is here. It is waiting. It is asking, as it has always been asking, to be continued. And somewhere in the Smithsonian's vast archive of the American past, or in a field in Ohio, or in the memory of a living community whose ancestors built the stone chamber that Josiah Harmon found, the answer is patient. The silence is not. The questions endure. The truth endures. And the silence, after 120 years, is still waiting to be broken by the honest light of a full,